Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1381. Inside the White Tower, the headquarters of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. After Luca Brewster, who was trapped underground, completed his prayer, he focused his attention back on the seal autonomously strengthening itself. He wanted to find out exactly what was going on, to see if he could decipher the secrets hidden within and use them to invent some mystical techniques. As he proceeded down each level, checking each and every sealed artifact, Luca was taken aback and stopped in his tracks. His expression became rather confused. He was lost on whether to take his next step with his left foot or right foot. This seemed to be a very profound, esoteric question to comprehend. In the southern continent, beside a cathedral belonging to the Evernite goddess, Leonard picked up the cup of coffee made from local ground beans and wanted to take a sip. During this process, his thoughts wandered to the closed windows and the bright sky, trying to figure out the anomaly. However, he was unable to leave the room and was sealed here. As for Old Man, Palace Zoroast, he had fallen into a strange state of silence without answering his questions. Thankfully, there wasn't any additional danger. Therefore, Leonard could still sit in peace, using thoughts to replace action. After an unknown period of time, he looked down at the cup of coffee that had been placed back on the table. He frowned slightly and muttered to himself in puzzlement, "What did I want to do just now?" The Roasted Archipelago, in the concealed Bayam city. Having not noticed the changes in the environment, Danitz carefully fiddled with the telegraph device in his room. The Golden Dream had recently come to the Sonia Sea and stopped at a port with a telegraph office. Danitz wanted to invite them over to Bayam as guests to take in the grandeur of a Lord's Oracle. If possible, he wished that the Golden Dream could use Bayam as its primary harbor. This way, he could return to the ship at any time to participate in adventures and seek out treasures. At the same time, he could choose to listen to the captain's lectures. As an all-rounder, Danitz had no doubt mastered all the knowledge and techniques needed to send a telegram. At that moment, he sat in front of the machine and quickly tapped his fingers, sending out the words he had constructed. At the very beginning, his thoughts were clear and his words were proper. This left him somewhat smug. Gradually, his eyes stared straight and his hands didn't stop moving, as if he was doing it on instinct. After the telegram was sent out, Danitz exhaled, picked up a cup, and gulped down a mouthful of beer. It was quicker than I expected. Even if I lose my job in the future, I can still go to the telegraph office to get a job with a good salary, Danitz thought proudly and worriedly. He casually picked up the telegram draft and recalled the process of how he sent it out. His expression gradually turned odd. What did I send in the end? Danitz couldn't help but whisper. Apparently, he had very likely mocked the first mate, second mate, iron skin, and barreled towards the latter half of the telegram. Then, he passionately confessed to the captain. I'm finished. Why would I express what's hidden in my heart? Danitz's face turned pale as he suspected that he had been controlled by the potion. The content he had written didn't actually go through his head. He hurriedly sent a telegram to indicate that the content from before had nothing to do with him. It was all a result of Anderson deliberately causing trouble. At this moment, he realized that something was amiss outside. The sky was grey and there wasn't a single cloud. In the astral world, the existences and objects that had been concealed by the Evernite goddess broke through the restrictions and returned to reality one after another. They were like Amorn's actual body, looking somewhat dazed without making any immediate reaction. In addition, the Evernite goddess also paused in mid-air in confusion, as though she hadn't thought about her subsequent actions. However, her first instinct was to protect herself. The Lord of Storms, the eternal blazing sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, who had been restricted by the thick prism-like spots of light in their own kingdoms, also experienced certain changes. The intensity of their counterattacks was clearly lower, giving people a sense of self-doubt, unsure if the entity before them was an enemy. The genie abandoned the Trunsoist brass book and directly returned to the magic wishing lamp. He seemed to have fought to his limits and had no choice but to retreat into the seal. He also seemed to recall something as he subconsciously evaded. Antigonus, who had just regained his self-awareness and lucidity, was once again confused. His face was filled with question marks. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? What is happening around me? In the forsaken land of the gods, the ancient sun god's giant shadow sighed and said, "Let there be light." The light in the astral world brightened as it stabbed into the eyes of Amon's true body, avatars, primordial demonis, hidden sage, and other existences. They immediately regained their senses and made use of the time to respond differently. The flood of information suddenly dispersed and fused with the various symbols around it, instantly disappearing. The black, python-like tentacles with an eyeball on their ends retracted rapidly. No one knew where they went. Amon's true body looked at Klein, who had just advanced, and gave up the chance to exert his influence while his condition was unstable. He raised his hand and adjusted the crystal monocle on his right eye. His figure split into multiple seemingly illusory and realistic doors. The doors opened and closed at the same time, preventing any existences like the Evernite goddess from knowing where Amon's true body had gone to. After Amon's true body left, his avatars faded and disappeared in a bizarre manner. This was using a loophole, turning the act of Amon's true body leaving to being equivalent to Amon's leaving. At the same time, the giant shadow that the ancient sun god had expanded only to shrink and transform back into Adam, who carried a thick shadow on his back. Beneath the feet of this visionary, the sea that contained all colors instantly dissipated as though it had returned underground. Looking up at the astral world, Adam returned to the back of that shadow screen through a crack. The fusion between him and the true creator had just begun, and it wasn't over yet. The attempt to raise himself to the level of half a great old one was actually rather difficult and risky. This would make their progress a lot slower in the future. In the astral world, as the war subsided, the natural barrier formed by plants and the portraits of civilization faded away, along with the illusory crimson moon. The Lord of Storms, eternal blazing sun, and the God of knowledge and wisdom first shattered the thick spots of light outside their divine kingdoms. Then, they calmed down and returned to continue blocking the world barrier's cracks. The Evernite goddess, who was floating above the ancient palace, put away the pitch-black coffin, the twilight sword, the bird-shaped, golden accessory, and her 4 arms. She cast her gaze downwards. After the translucent dark-colored cloak produced the mask, it transformed into Klein's body. Klein pressed one hand against the almost invisible mask on his face, and he placed the other at his abdomen. His back was slightly arched, as though he was suffering indescribable pain. Just as he raised his head and looked at the Evernite goddess's face that was covered with a thin black veil, a pitch-black cloak appeared outside his body. Slippery and sinister tentacles extended from beneath the cloak. After becoming the fool, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in him had undoubtedly awakened further. The crazy ravings and roars continued to echo in Klein's ears, tearing through his mind, letting him know that this was going to be his future. There was no way to kill the Lord of the Mysteries. Even if his will was slowly worn down by time, his consciousness would remain forever. He could snatch Klein's body at any moment and completely revive. If it wasn't for the fact that he had just killed the Lord of the Mysteries' will, making the awakening him weaker than what Klein expected, Klein suspected that he might not be able to survive. All he could do was watch as his body collapsed and he became another existence. Of course, he could still seek the Evernite goddess's help to give him a drop of the river of eternal darkness's river water. However, this wasn't a long-term solution. He could only delay it for some time before ultimately facing it. Relying on his own consciousness and anchors, Klein stabilized the consciousness of the celestial worthy in him. At this moment, he was unable to speak. The Evernite goddess above nodded gently and said, "What you need now is stability." Latest novels on novelby/n.com. With that said, her figure was wiped inch by inch as she returned to the divine kingdom in the astral world. Klein turned his head to look at the slightly dazed Antigonus. With a thought, he returned to Sapphira Castle. Sitting in the half-collapsed palace, Antigonus sat on a huge stone chair. He felt as though he had just been through a very, very long dream. Inside Sapphira Castle, Klein sat at the full seat and focused on stabilizing his mental state. Just like before he achieved an initial level of stability, he had no way of seeking treatment from a psychiatrist. Unless he paid a visit to Adam, it was very likely that he would go even crazier. With some stability, Klein quickly checked the authorities he obtained. It was called fooling. Not only did it contain history, time, fate, change, and concealment, but it also included the mind domains of blind stupidity. The simplest application was to lower an enemy's intelligence. Just as Klein was about to research them further, his spiritual perception was triggered. Someone had invaded Sapphire Castle. And only when the enemy successfully invaded did Klein obtain a notification. Klein suddenly looked up and saw that the greyish-white fog had formed a door at the other end of the long wattle table. A figure wearing a pointed hat, a classic black robe, and a monocle walked out. Amorn. There was a tinge of darkness in Mr. Error's eyes as his smile appeared somewhat crazy. He leisurely looked around and nudged his monocle. He said with a smile, "Are you pleasantly surprised?" Klein wanted to use Sapphire Castle to expel him, but he realized that at some point in time, Amorn had gained control over Sapphire Castle. Amorn cast his gaze at him, pulled out a chair and sat down, chuckling. "I released the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries in my body. Him being the owner of Sapphire Castle makes me equivalent to being the owner of Sapphire Castle. Of course, I can enter. This is very risky. Even in the past, I didn't dare to try it before, but since you've grown to this extent, I can only take the risk. This is very exciting. I'm quite pleased with the effects." As Amorn spoke, slippery and sinister tentacles appeared beneath his clothes. He took the initiative to revive part of the Lord of the Mysteries, allowing himself to enter a half-crazy state. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1382. As Amorn spoke, Klein appeared to be listening, but he had actually attempted to leave Sapphire Castle. This wasn't because he wanted to give up or surrender, nor was it because he was too timid and subconsciously considered fleeing first. Instead, he believed that this was the best solution for the current situation. If he stayed in Sapphire Castle, Klein would face 3 difficult questions. Firstly, he had just advanced to the fall and his condition was extremely unstable. He had to divert a large portion of his mental strength to suppress the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Secondly, there was no way for him to obtain the help of his allies, he could only fight alone. Thirdly, under the situation that everyone could influence Sapphire Castle, even if Klein had a deeper level of control over Sapphire Castle, he wouldn't be able to express an overwhelming advantage. He might even be disrupted in his use of Sapphire Castle because his opponent was good at making use of loopholes and creating bugs, making it difficult for him to reach the same level as him. This way, when a sequence 0 the Fool faced a half-crazed, dual pathway error and door, even if he wasn't in a scenario of facing up 100% failure rate, the chances of winning were extremely minute. And by taking the opportunity to escape Sapphire Castle, Klein could immediately obtain the help of his allies to reverse the situation between the two. If Amorn were to chase after him, Klein would interfere with his return to Sapphire Castle and make him face his allies. At that time, the primordial Demonis would definitely not attack again. The ancient sun god might not be able to reproduce the power of half a great old one anytime soon. With the lead of the Ebonite goddess, the 6 orthodox deities were enough to deal with Amorn. Even if Amorn, who was in control of all the authorities of the error and door domains, wasn't easily killed, the orthodox deities would definitely be able to weaken him and seal him. After Klein stabilized his mental state and deepened his control over Sapphire Castle, he could then kill him in a targeted manner. This process was almost irreversible even if the ancient sun god could still produce the level, status, and strength from before. His limit appeared to be suppressing 3 orthodox deities at the same time, and this didn't include the Ebonite goddess. Of course, the outer deities were undoubtedly unwilling to see the birth of a new Lord of the Mysteries. Once such a situation happened, they would definitely try their best to interfere, preventing Amorn from dying. However, before the world barrier collapsed, the influence they could exert would be rather limited, and it might not be of much use. Just like before, Klein believed that the combined powers of the dark side of the universe and the chained god were inferior to the hidden sage. Even if the outer deities managed to affect the situation, Klein wouldn't suffer any losses. After all, those existences wouldn't allow Amorn to kill him either. He could find a place to hide and stabilize his mental state. Once he was prepared, he could make new plans again. The foggy town of the Evernight Goddess was a very good choice. If Amon didn't chase after him and remained inside Sapphira Castle, Klein could use his identity as the owner of Sapphira Castle to influence the control of all kinds of matters within at any moment, preventing Amon from doing anything in Sapphira Castle. Even if he wanted to use the Crimson Star to deal with the Tarot Club members, it would be impossible. In short, it would be extremely difficult for either of them to use Sapphira Castle well, but destroying the other party's attempts was definitely simple. Under such a stalemate, Klein had time to stabilize his mental state, deepening his control over Sapphira Castle, slowly turning the situation around. Towards the end, Amon would either flee and hide, or he would let the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings completely revive, choosing to have an internecine outcome with Klein. Therefore, although he didn't have the time to analyze the pros and cons, Klein quickly came to a conclusion. Leaving Sapphira Castle now was the best choice. However, just as his consciousness sank to the edge of Sapphira Castle, he saw a crystal monocle. This item appeared in time, crushing Klein's hopes of escaping. Did you think I'd leave such an obvious loophole? Of course, you can stop me from leaving Sapphira Castle at any time. Amon curled his index finger and pressed it against the monocle as he smiled. Behind the chair that he was sitting on, the resplendent symbol rapidly changed. At times, it was formed from symbols corresponding to parasitizing, time, and fate. At times, it was a series of doors. These two different symbols appeared one after another, making it impossible to truly be fixed. Klein didn't hear what Amon said. The moment he failed, he created a real realm of mystery as a complete divine kingdom of the Fool. Light and shadows instantly changed in front of Amon's eyes. It brought with it the disappearance of the grand palace, mottled table, and luxurious high-backed chair, bringing with it an ancient castle. Amon wasn't sure what the ancient castle looked like. This was because he was standing in a corridor inside the castle. He could only sense the various changes in Sapphira Castle and see with the limited vision he had. The corridor was unusually dark and gloomy. The corridor stretched endlessly. There were silver-colored elegant candlestands spaced widely apart, each producing a dim and yellow glow. There were dark red wooden doors on both sides of the corridor that seemed to connect to different rooms. There was no sound from the rooms, making it virtually impossible to know what was hidden inside. Amon casually glanced at it and smiled with interest. Interesting. As the most powerful cryptologist, he naturally knew that this was a divine kingdom, one that couldn't be broken through with brute force. This was because every door was reassembled with different items. If he forcefully broke through them, he would trigger unknown effects. Amon didn't underestimate the abilities and intelligence of a Sequence Zero the Fool. He didn't plan on experiencing any more surprises or accidents. However, once the Divine Kingdom's rules were fixed, its owner would similarly be restricted to a certain extent. To put it simply, Klein was definitely in one of the rooms, not somewhere else. One had to bear the corresponding responsibility for the benefits obtained. You want to use this method to stall for time and stabilize your mental state? Amon whispered as though he was talking to an invisible person. Then, wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, he walked to the nearest dark red wooden door. There were no holes on the wooden door, so he couldn't see the exact situation inside. In other words, it was very difficult for Amon to know if Klein was here without opening the door. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up slightly. Amon extended his right hand and drew a long rectangular shape on the dark red wooden door. Inside the rectangle, bits of starlight emerged and turned transparent, revealing the scene in the room. With the authority of door and the ability of bug, Amon forcibly opened a window without triggering the effects. Following that, he cast his gaze into the room. There were no tables, chairs, carpets, and other furniture, but a blue sea. Indeed, this door has been connected with the sea outside, Amon said without any surprise. Once he twisted the door, he would leave Sapphira Castle and appear in the sea outside. And at that time, with Klein being wary, it was almost impossible for him to enter Sapphira Castle again, just like how Klein was unable to leave Sapphira Castle. This was the reason why Amon didn't forcibly destroy the Fool's divine kingdom but opened one door at a time. Destruction led to similar effects. The repeated effects would affect Amon again and again. Even if there were many loopholes that he could use, he wouldn't be completely immune to them. Retracting his gaze, Amon walked to the opposite room and opened a window according to the method from before. However, this time, it was pitch black inside, and he couldn't see anything. Amon raised his hand and pinched the edge of his monocle and coughed lightly. His figure instantly split into two. The number of Amons increased. The split Amon glanced at Amon, who stood in the same spot, and scared. "Why aren't you seeking the thrill yourself?" As he spoke, this Amon extended his right palm and grabbed the handle of the dark red wooden door. Just as he began twisting, his expression suddenly turned blank as he sat down, as though he had lost the ability to think. Fooling effect. The original Amon nodded slightly. The retarded Amon immediately collapsed and turned into a transparent worm with 12 segments. Tiny bits of Beyonder characteristics seeped out and returned to Amon's body. Find the newest novels on n/o/velbin.com. He relied on using the loophole to avoid the negative effects of his avatars from acting on his actual body. After all the Beyonder characteristics returned, Amon released a flame that had been stolen and burned the corpse of the Worm of Time. After doing this leisurely, he looked up and adjusted the monocle on his right eye. On the crystal monocle, countless symbols, patterns, and labels appeared. They moved quickly, interweaving, reforming, or changing, as though they were making calculations. This was a combination of a cryptologist's power of decryption and the key of Star's authority on position. The two attempts Amon made were mainly to gather intelligence, grasp the rules, and prepare for cracking the secrets of the Fool's divine kingdom. Soon, the symbols, patterns, and labels formed a scene on the monocle. Behind a dark red wooden door, a few slippery tentacles extended out from Klein's body. He sat on a high-backed chair and calmly watched the entrance. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up. With a flash, he appeared in the room. However, everything before his eyes suddenly collapsed. Klein with the Fool's aura quickly turned thin, turning into a card. On the card, Roselle Gustav was wearing a gorgeous head accessory and colorful clothes, holding a stick with luggage hanging from it. His eyes were filled with longing. The Fool card. The Fool card from the Cards of Blasphemy. Klein knew that relying solely on paper figurine substitutes and adding the fooling effect and grafting his true aura onto it wouldn't be able to deceive a top-notch swindler like Amon. Therefore, he used the Fool card, which had some convergence powers, as his paper figurine. Although Sapphira Castle couldn't be used again, this was Klein's home ground after all. There was his junk pile, the various items he had gathered, and the newly obtained Trunsoist brass book and the borrowed magic wishing lamp. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1383. With the Klein in front of Amon turning into the Fool card, the room shrank and revealed its original appearance. It was an iron cigar case that had marks of being corroded slightly. It had fused with the aura of Sapphira Castle. Klein's figure appeared out of nowhere as the entire divine kingdom of the Fool collapsed. As the magnificent palace reappeared, he grabbed the vessel that carried the Fool card and Amon's true body and suddenly closed it. He didn't have hopes of using this item to seal Amon, who wielded the corresponding authority of the door pathway. All he wanted was to buy some time and find a chance to throw Amon out of Sapphira Castle and retrieve the initiative. But at that moment, Klein, who was wearing a black trench coat, paused. His other hand took out a crystal monocle from the void with his other hand and placed it in his right eye. Behind him, Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, quickly outlined his figure. His eyes were dark and wild as he laughed. "What made you think that I didn't use an avatar?" Before he finished his sentence, Klein's figure that had been parasitized rapidly turned thin, turning into a crude paper figurine. Klein was cautious and hadn't used his true form either. He relied on a paper figurine substitute that had spirit body threads grafted. He knew very well that he would rather give up an opportunity than make mistakes when fighting Amon. Once he made a mistake, under the suppression effect of a bug, it would be very difficult for him to turn the tables. With regards to the situation of the prey turning into a paper figurine, Amon didn't seem to be surprised. All he did was raise his hand to touch the crystal monocle. At the other end of the Grand Palace, Klein, who was wearing a top hat and a trench coat, uncontrollably walked out of the fool's automatic concealment. Upstood AT from N0/V/pound/co/M. He raised his right hand and took out a crystal monocle from the void with great difficulty, slowly moving it towards his right eye. During this process, Klein's expression was filled with resistance and rather warped, as though he couldn't control his hand. The half-crazy Amon smiled leisurely. You can use paper figurines to replace you, but so can paper figurines replace you. It being parasitized is equivalent to you being parasitized. Everything is relative, and all of them have loopholes. No Beyonder power is uncrackable. They can be used in any suitable situation. He made use of the relationship of the paper figurine substitute and the main body to create a bug. Although Amon looked like he was unable to control his desire to speak due to his madness, it didn't stop him from corroding Klein with his full strength. He strengthened the parasitizing bit by bit, making Klein truly wear a monocle and become him. At that moment, Klein's body suddenly collapsed. He had taken the initiative to do so. He split into countless transparent maggots that swam in all directions. Among these worms of spirit, there were a few worms of time with 12 segments mixed in. Strictly speaking, Amon's worms of time could forcefully parasitize very tiny creatures like the worms of spirit. However, when Klein split up, he took the initiative to use his fooling authority to confuse the order of time. He fooled the few worms of time, making them split up only towards the end. Unable to find the cluster of worms of spirit, they lost their target for parasitizing. In the next second, the scene in Sapphira Castle changed again. Klein once again used the Realm of Mystery's powers to create a new divine kingdom for the fool. Amon instantly entered a room. This place was covered with a thick yellow carpet with a crystal chandelier hanging from it. There was a door on each wall, and it was unknown where they led to. At the same time, there were oil paintings depicting various eyes hanging from the four walls. There was no need for any special scrutiny. With just a glance, Amon knew that the four doors corresponded to different effects. The main purpose was to delay his actions and create enough time for Klein to make subsequent preparations. The corners of Mr. Error curled up slightly as he cast his gaze to the ground. He extended his right fist and stretched out his fingers. An illusory door appeared on the thick yellow carpet. The door quickly moved for a second before it became fixed in place and silently opened. However, with the opening of the illusory door, the doors around the room began to move strangely. The doors creaked and opened. Almost at the same time, in the pitch-black wilderness, in a dark tower that led to the sky, Klein was holding the magic wishing lamp and removing the effects of fooling on the Trunsoist brass book. The candlewick of the magic wishing lamp lit up as it spewed out a sticky, pale gold glow. These rays of light transformed into a distorted, blurry figure. Klein didn't consider making a wish with the genie to transfer Bernadette's wishes onto him and change the ownership of the magic wishing lamp. This was because there would only be one outcome. He would die on the spot and return from the fog of history with the miracle invoker's powers. Normally, this was a good way to escape, especially since Klein could revive several times. However, the situation this time was completely different from before. Once Klein died, it would mean that he had temporarily given up on his identity as the owner of Sapphira Castle, making this place a paradise for Amon. He could use this Sapphira without any obstruction. Under such circumstances, Amon could completely fool history, interfere with fate, and suppress Klein's resurrection, making him truly die. The ones who were most effective against a Beyonder were definitely higher sequence Beyonders of the same pathway. Therefore, Klein's current plan was to use the status of the genie to better use the Trunsoist brass book. If the genie didn't exert a certain influence, the rules set by the Trunsoist brass book definitely wouldn't be biased towards Klein. It would only restrict all existences other than itself. As the genie's blurry, pale gold figure took form, the Trunsoist brass book produced the sound of colliding metal and quickly flipped to the second half of the book that allowed writing. Without any gap in time, new text appeared on the brass page. Theft is prohibited here. If Klein had the choice, the most suitable rule would be acts of theft are prohibited here because the former clause was a law. It couldn't stop someone from committing theft ahead of time, and it could only deliver punishment after the act. Furthermore, punishment for first-time thieves was inevitably light, something the Amons could withstand. His idea restricted the possibility of such actions. There was no such thing as theft. However, there was no way for the Trunsoist brass book to make such a rule right now. One had to wait until the provisions were watertight enough, and that it had awakened to a certain extent before that was possible. Previously, the genie had relied on his close connection with the Trunsoist brass book, his high status, and all his strength before he could enforce similar rules. At this moment, he was already drained and unable to do such things. At present, all Klein could do was try his best to stall for time so that the Trunsoist brass book could produce a sufficiently strict setup of laws to target Amon so as to act in concert with his fooling authority. At this moment, in the room that trapped Amon, as the illusory door on the ground opened, the 4 real doors shook and cracks appeared. This would bring about many unknown effects. Suddenly, the sound of a bell rang out from an endless distance away. At some point in time, Amon had transformed into an ancient, mottled stone wall clock. On the wall clock, the second hand formed by the worm of time suddenly paused. Gong! As the bell reverberated, everything in the room froze strangely, including the 4 doors. The only exception was Amon. He had transformed back to his pointy-hatted, classic black rogue look. With a smile, he calmly raised his left hand and tightened his 5 fingers. In the next second, the strange frozen state was broken. The 4 doors that were about to open had closed again with a bang, leaving no gaps behind. Amon's figure descended and burrowed into the illusory door that wasn't closed. Just as he used this method to leave the room, he discovered that he had arrived in a pitch-black wilderness. There was a dark tower that seemed to pierce the sky in the distance. Inside the tower, the Trunsoist brass book in front of Klein had formed a second rule. Deception is prohibited here. Although Amon couldn't see what was happening, it was as though he had sensed something. After all, a high-ranking person who used the rules of deception as entertainment was undoubtedly able to sense the changes in the rules. Otherwise, there was no way of accurately finding loopholes. He immediately raised his hand and adjusted the monocle stuck in his right eye. On the surface of the crystal monocle, a blinding, pure white light spewed out, illuminating the wilderness. There were no longer any concealed existences here. This was the eternal daytime that he had previously given to Klein and retrieved from Klein's main body. In such an environment, the dark tower melted inch by inch. Klein floated in midair with one hand holding the magic wishing lamp and the other holding the staff of the stars. In front of him was the open Trunsoist brass book. Amon took the opportunity to stretch out his hand that was holding onto the monocle. From a distance, he gripped Klein's projection to his palm. Behind him, the shadow that had been dragged out by the eternal daytime seemed to become fainter as it twisted with vitality. Without a sound, Amon began stealing Klein's various beyonder powers. He didn't deliberately seek out the fooling authority. Instead, he chose to be random to increase the success rate. However, with a flash of light, what fell into his palm was only a simple paper figurine. Grafting. Pa. The shadow behind Amon's back was lashed by an invisible whip, and he was completely unharmed. He created an error, letting his shadow replace him. Following that, Amon laughed as his voice resounded in Klein's ears. Genie, I can also promise to send you back to the cosmos. Look, I wasn't punished. This means that I'm not swindling you. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1384. Upon hearing Amon's words, Klein's heart sank. Latest novels on novel.by/n.com. Before this, he wasn't worried that Amon would collude with Genie because he was a top-notch swindler. No promises he made could be believed. As for Genie, he had encountered the former Lord of the Mysteries. He was considered a victim of such matters in a similar vein. Therefore, he would definitely use his most wary of approaches to deal with Mr. Error. This was the result of a lack of trust. Sometimes, lying, cheating, and swindling could indeed increase the profits in the short term, but in the long term, it was better to be honest. But now, the Trunsoist brass book had just formulated the rule of deception is prohibited here. And Amorn didn't receive any punishment after making the promise. At the same time, Klein and Jeannie didn't notice him using any loopholes. This proved how true and effective Amorn's words were. It was from the bottom of his heart and wasn't a scam. Jeannie could even rely on his own level and traits to distort the sentence from I can promise to I promise. It would make it impossible for Amorn to go back on his word. If he did, he would suffer damage at the level of a great old one. This made Klein not help but wonder if the rule that deception is prohibited here was secretly guided by Amorn or deliberately created by Jeannie, making any Lord of the Mysteries candidate to promise to return him to the cosmos. To Jeannie, he didn't suffer any losses in such a deal because Klein himself owed him a promise. If it were any other scene, Klein would still have the time to communicate with Jeannie and rebuild his trust. However, at this moment, Amorn's threat was right before his eyes. He wouldn't give him the chance to resolve this problem. If he chose to continue to believe in Jeannie, Klein would be putting his life in the hands of this outer deity and be under his control. In the subsequent battle, as long as Jeannie was able to formulate a few rules that appeared to be fine but were biased towards Amorn through the Trunsoist brass book, Klein, who was already at a great disadvantage, would rapidly lose with no way to reverse the situation. As his thoughts raced, Klein made the choice of this gamble. A translucent dark-colored cloak instantly appeared around him. His face was covered with a strange and distorted mask. The fool. Invisible rings rippled from his body and instantly enveloped Jeannie, the Trunsoist brass book, and the entire wilderness, as well as Amorn. Blind stupidity or authority. Amorn's monocle temporarily lost its luster, as though he had lost his vision. His gaze also turned dull. The speed of text being written on the Trunsoist brass book clearly slowed down, as though it would take 15 minutes or even hours to think up the next rule. Jeannie's blurry and distorted golden figure shook as it suddenly shrank back into the golden magic lamp that looked like a water flask. It was unknown if it was escaping or if it was purely an instinctual reaction. Seizing this opportunity, Klein attempted to escape Sapphira Castle as he prepared to graft something to himself. Just as his consciousness sank, the crystal monocle appeared at the edge of Sapphira Castle, blocking his path. Even though his intelligence had been reduced briefly, Amorn still seemed to remember to stop Klein from leaving Sapphira Castle. His eyes quickly regained clarity as they were still dyed black. His mouth slowly opened as he laughed uncontrollably. I've written this matter into my instinct. This is a good way to resist the effects of blind stupidity. Clearly, he had cheated the rules and lied to himself, making his instincts believe that this was what he wanted. Klein wasn't depressed. He immediately completed the grafting he had prepared long ago. In the cosmos, a giant star that emitted light and heat suddenly dimmed. In the wilderness, with the effects of eternal daylight, an orange sun with a destructive aura and a heavy feeling descended from the sky. The entire wilderness collapsed and curled up as though it was going to charge straight into the star. At the same time, everything here was ignited, including Amorn. In the next second, the surrounding void began to shrink as they revolved around the real sun. Everything in the world either disintegrated or vaporized. All that was left was the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, which were still struggling to withstand the flames, barely suffering any damage. Klein, who was floating in midair, had long disappeared. He had grafted himself to that star. Of course, his grafting was only with the concept of a star, not a physical entity. Otherwise, with the fool's obviously lower defense than most sequence zeros, he would be directly swallowed by a real star and die on the spot thanks to his relatively weak body. The fool was a very extreme deity. He had the ability to destroy a star, but he was unable to face it directly. His strengths and weaknesses were equally obvious. In addition, conceptualized objects couldn't directly affect the surrounding environment and harm the enemy. It wasn't enough to write the words immense mass, gravity, high temperatures, high heat, and fusion to create similar effects, but as Mr. Fool, Klein held the authority of fooling. He made his surroundings change according to the concept of a star. This was an intense change and also a type of fooling. Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, was completely ignited under the illumination of the star. He began to vaporize. At this moment, his figure distorted as he was instantly dyed with resplendent starlight. He turned extremely illusory, as though he had transformed into an astral door. At that moment, Amon no longer resembled a physical creature. He was closer to a collective body of the symbols like wandering, astral world tunnel, key, and door. This was the ability of a planeswalker to use the astral world to head to different planets and worlds. They were able to transform themselves into symbols, allowing them to effectively use the astral world. At Sequence 0 Door's stage, the qualitative change in such powers became conceptualized. Amon transformed himself into a concept creature and avoided the damage brought by the star. A figure suddenly appeared behind him. It was Klein, who was wearing a trench coat and a top hat. Almost at the same time, Amon's thought slowed down a little. His spirit body threads were grabbed by Klein. Using the chaos brought by the star, Klein dispelled the combination he had with the corresponding concepts, and he secretly grafted the location of both parties and arrived behind Amon. Originally, without the concept of reassembly, the star's influence on the surroundings would immediately stop. However, Klein had full time, allowing the effects of the first 2 seconds to linger until now, allowing him to fool Amon. If possible, what Klein wished to do now was to deepen the control of Amon's spirit body threads and turn him into his marionette. However, he knew very well that in the present situation, the probability of success was very low. On the one hand, Amon could withstand damage and steal the spirit body threads back. On the other hand, he might be able to use the connection established between the two of them via the spirit body threads to use a bug and influence Klein and parasitize him. Before he had absolute confidence, Klein didn't want his actions to appear rash. The main goal of capturing Amon's spirit body threads was to give the other party a certain sense of sluggishness. This was a performance of the fooling authority during the stage of transforming into a marionette. And with Klein's present state, he was naturally more willing to choose such a low-level but effective method. This would be less of a burden on him, and it wouldn't seriously affect his mental stability like when he used the authority of fooling. At this moment, apart from Amon, his enemy also included the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body. Of course, Amon was the same. If he didn't suppress the celestial worthy's madness, the latter would have already revived in his body. After creating a brief pause in Amon's thoughts, Klein had 3 choices. The first was to take this opportunity to escape Sapphira Castle, but he wasn't sure if Amon's instincts were still working and would still attempt to stop him from escaping. Second, it was to summon the projections of the historical void, but it wasn't of much use. The effects of an angel-level existence could do little in this battle of gods. It was possible that they couldn't withstand Amon's gaze, much less their historical projections. Even if Klein wanted to use it to transmit information, it lacked sufficient value that other deities couldn't enter Sapphira Castle and provide help. Third, he could use this opportunity to exert a certain amount of influence on Amon's true body. Without any hesitation, Klein chose the third plan. He wanted to take the opportunity to graft Amon, Sapphira Castle, and the Door of Light that was stained with bluish-black together. Klein felt that Amon's half-crazy state wasn't bad enough. He just appeared rather talkative, with him occasionally not grasping an opportunity. He wanted to make him go crazier. When Amon and Sapphira Castle completed the reassembly, the celestial worthy's will in his body would clearly strengthen, and the chaos in his mind would intensify. That way, Amon would lack the rationality to restrain himself, making his actions more instinctive than being the result of a contemplative thinking process. To Mr. Error, who was an expert at deceit, this would be fatal. Of course, Klein could only maintain this kind of grafting for a second. Exceeding this limit might mean that he would no longer be facing Amon, but the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When the time came, the other party would definitely gladly accept the gift of Sapphira Castle. He could then fight Sequence 0 the Fall with a Sapphira, 2 uniquenesses, and the corresponding Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics. Originally, Klein could have relied on his fooling authority to reduce Amon's intelligence, but firstly, he wasn't able to use power at this level for a long time in his current state. Secondly, as a dual pathway true god, and a wielder of many authorities, the duration of the blind stupidity effect on him was rather limited. Therefore, Klein had no choice but to take the risk of grafting things in such a way. And madness would accompany Amon, doing so until he found a new balance or met the best psychiatrist. In the blink of an eye, the translucent, cold mask appeared on Klein's face once again. A strange door of light that was stained with a hint of bluish-black suffused from Amon's body. Sapphira Castle. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1385. Amon and the strange door of light were grafted together. His face grimaced as the darkness in his eyes intensified. At the same time, more slippery tentacles appeared under his classic black robe, fully showcasing the crazy feeling was completely displayed. Just as Klein was preparing to sever the connection between Amon and Sapphira Castle and make him maintain his madness, the corners of Amon's mouth curled up. It was as if he was saying, "Congratulations, you have fallen into a trap." His face was immediately covered with a translucent mask that was similar to the fool's uniqueness, but one that was even more illusory. Klein's mind tensed up, and without a second thought, he immediately used the authority of fooling without any regard for the consequences. But before he could react, his thoughts slowed down. He was in a dazed state that he didn't know what to do. Fooling. Amon actually used the temporary reassembly between him and Sapphira Castle to escape Klein's interference and activate the power of the fool's domain. Such an action completely exceeded his instincts and was more like a meticulous trap. Amon didn't seem to be crazy enough. This true god of the era and door pathways immediately removed the grafting of himself to Sapphira Castle, allowing the mysterious door that was tainted with hints of bluish-black to quickly fade away to prevent him from being tainted further. After dealing with this latent danger, Amon raised both hands, his thumbs and index fingers touching each other to form an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, perfectly embracing Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Amon's hands suddenly parted to the side as though they were tearing something apart. This seemed to be a heavy task. With the tearing sounds of paper, the area where Klein's body was in seemed to turn into glass. Under the intense impact, countless cracks appeared as they shattered bit by bit. This was a form of regression and the destruction of space. Unable to withstand it at all, Klein's body could only turn into paper fragments that flew in the air as the surrounding void collapsed and shattered. These bits of paper were instantly swallowed up by the darkness. By the time the space collapsed, Klein's paper figurines were almost exhausted. Of course, he also relied on the level and traits of the fool to forcefully escape the effects of blind stupidity. And at this moment, Amon had already split into countless figures. Some of them were purely avatars, some were replicas on the level of symbolism, while others were left behind from constantly blinking. At that moment, the sky above Klein's head and the surrounding wilderness were occupied by Amons. They wore pointed hats and monocles, blocking every single loophole. Some of these Amons transformed into old, mottled, bluish-black wall clocks. Some of them turned into pure starlight, as though they were trying to create a cage. Some extended their hands, doing different levels of theft. Some of the monocles glowed as they used various items that they had stolen from the past. Some simulated various abilities, either exerting limitations, interference, or attacks. In the Marauder pathway, theft was a core skill, one of its main symbols. The difference between it and a seer's control of spirit body threads was that, as one advanced through the sequences, not only did its effects and success rate increase, it also obtained a deeper level of conceptualization. At sequence 9 to sequence 7, theft happened on items. At sequence 6, theft happened on beyonder powers. After advancing to sequence 5, theft happened on thoughts and ideas. At sequence 4 and sequence 3, theft became life, including parasitic theft at the physical level. And at sequence 2 level, the range of theft broadened to fate, identity, self-awareness, and beyonder characteristics. As for sequence 1, theft could temporarily happen on time, anchors, and authorities. Therefore, when an error faced a true deity, he could also use theft that had reached the level of authority. With a gong, the ancient wall clocks paused in unison. This caused the surrounding environment to freeze, causing the destroyed wilderness from the sun's blast to become extremely quiet. Even the destruction was frozen. At that moment, Klein seemed to lose his body. All that was left was a translucent dark-colored cloak and a bizarre ice-cold mask. Under the cloak and mask was rich darkness. Nothing could be seen other than the slippery and sinister tentacles that extended out. In such a state, Klein seemed to escape the limitations of time. In a frozen environment, he moved like a fish. Through various cracks in reality or concept, he emerged from the encirclement of the Amorns. He once again used his fooling authority. This time, he fooled time. The ancient wall clocks vanished, and in the desolate wilderness that had almost completely collapsed, time returned to its normal flow. The Amorn stopped their attempts, suddenly merged into one, and blinked behind Klein, preventing him from having a breather. His left palm reached out, and as he retracted it, he clenched his fingers. Visit novelbin.co/m for the latest updates. Around Klein, the space suddenly became shrouded in shadows, making it look like a thin fishnet veil. The fishnet veil began to twist and reassemble, as though they formed a sufficiently strong cage that trapped Klein inside. An illusory door appeared above the cage as it moved quickly without being fixed in place. However, Klein's figure suddenly appeared outside the cell, as though he had never been sealed by Amorn's door authority. He had fooled history and had split his previous and future self. Hence, the one imprisoned in the cell became his historical projection. This was the scholar of Yor's powers deepening under the fooling authority. As he had relied on an advancement ritual based on fooling history, Klein's the fool powers in such a domain were stronger than when he fooled time and fate. As soon as he escaped the spatial cell, Klein immediately used the realm of mysteries to create a new divine kingdom of the fool. This was to stall for time and find a chance to stabilize his mental state. He had used the fooling authority multiple times, and the weak balance in his body was on the verge of collapsing. If he didn't stabilize his mental state as soon as possible, the will of the celestial worthy would awaken further. This was also a serious problem. At this moment, a huge crystal monocle appeared in front of him. On this monocle, layers of sparkling light surged out and flooded him instantly. Klein's mental state suddenly stabilized, but the price was to lose all his emotions and desires. He didn't even want to resist. All he wanted was to stand there quietly and wait for the impending destruction. This was like an ordinary person being injected with a huge dose of anesthetic. At the same time, an illusory book appeared in the layers of light. The book opened, revealing a sentence. Tormented by the Lord of the Mysteries' mental corruption, Klein Moretti had always been in great pain and a state of extreme exhaustion. After the intense battle, he has finally reached his limits due to the influence of his mind. He had decided to give up and stop resisting. Behind the huge crystal monocle, Amorn, who was wearing a pointed hat and classic black robe, quickly outlined himself like a mountain. He looked at Klein, who had given up resisting, and his dark eyes turned lighter as the corners of his lips curled up. "I stole it." "How is it?" Klein raised his head to look at Mr. Error, and he tried hard to open his mouth. He said weakly, "You were pulling off a deception from the beginning?" Amorn raised his hands and said with a smile, "Unfortunately, you realized it too late." He made his thumbs and index fingers touch each other, forming an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, illuminating Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Amorn solemnly separated his hands, tearing apart the void where Klein and the surrounding environment relied on to live. The void was like glass, shattering into pieces like the collapse of a skyscraper. However, all the collapsing and destruction circled Klein's body without directly affecting him. He was like a small fishing boat that calmly cruised through a storm. It appeared out of place and disharmonious, as though it didn't seem to belong here. Amorn raised his hand and adjusted his monocle on his right eye, the smile on his face somewhat faded. A translucent cloak kept popping up and disappearing over the surface of Klein's body. He looked at the mountain like Amorn, his eyes turning darker. "From the moment you entered Sapphira Castle and said the first word, you began your deceit." At that time, Amorn said that he had taken the risk to release the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries in his body in exchange for the identity of Sapphira Castle's owner. At that moment, Amorn didn't take the opportunity to continue attacking Klein. He floated in midair and looked down at Mr. Fool. Klein didn't make any attempts either. His tone was strangely calm, as though he was preparing something. If simply releasing the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries will allows you to enter Sapphira Castle at the cost of being half crazy, Antigonus could have done so back then. The Annihilation demonic wolf, Phlegria, from even earlier could have done it as well. You and Mr. Dorr previously had countless opportunities. Clearly, it's impossible to invade Sapphira Castle by just making the Lord of the Mysteries awaken to a certain extent and using half craziness in concert with error. There's no way you can find a usable bug in this matter unless you directly get him to replace you. Only when you possess the door authority to go anywhere did you see hope. By creating a back door and using bugs, you could make Sapphira Castle treat you as the Lord of the Mysteries and give you the corresponding authority. Of course, this will definitely require the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries to a rather dangerous state. Without this hidden identity, you won't be able to deceive Sapphira Castle without any reason. After absorbing Door's uniqueness, you didn't immediately infiltrate Sapphira Castle to deal with me, who was even weaker back then. It was because at that time you were unable to completely withstand the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will, with you having just advanced. I believe you've already found a relatively safer solution. If I hadn't advanced to the Fall so quickly, you would have been able to enter Sapphira Castle in the best state to resolve everything sometime later. And now, you have no choice but to bring this plan forward. There's definitely a very serious problem with you. You took the initiative to throw out the price of becoming half crazy to, on the one hand, make me think of countermeasures in this direction so as to lay a deadly trap in key areas, and on the other hand, you also wanted to divert attention and use this opportunity to conceal other problems. You're not half mad at all. Amorn quietly listened to Klein's words. Rather abnormally, he didn't interrupt him, nor did he attempt to attack. Only when Klein was done did he say with an odd expression, "You're crazy." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1386. Upon hearing Amorn's "You're crazy," Klein raised his head and laughed out loud. "I just gave up according to your arrangements. It's just that it's more complete than you think." As he spoke, an illusory brand appeared on the forehead of the ice-cold and bizarre mask he was wearing. It was a strange door of light that was tainted with bluish blackness. As for Klein, he was also enveloped in something similar. Under the translucent dark-colored cloak, more and more slippery and sinister tentacles appeared. They were densely packed and extended until they occupied the nearby sky. As his dark eyes flashed, Klein looked at Amorn and said with a smile, "For me, instead of you becoming the Lord of the Mysteries, wouldn't it be better if we let the past him revive?" After his mental state stabilized and he figured out the key to Amorn's surprise attack, Klein's thoughts of giving up removed his resistance towards the Lord of the Mysteries' will in his body, allowing him to further revive. It was precisely because of this that he was able to control Sapphira Castle at critical moments and borrow the power of error to avoid the collapse of the space created by Amorn. Without waiting for Amorn's response, the corners of Klein's lips curled up as he said with a smile, "After you were corrupted by Sapphira Castle and showed signs of madness, you immediately recovered and could use Sapphira Castle to create the effects of blind stupidity. After releasing the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries' will in you, you didn't enter a half-crazy state, as there are external powers helping you. You should have an extremely key important avatar. It might even be like Pal's choice to lower his level. It's sleeping at Adam's place, and it allows a visionary like him to personally protect your mental state. As long as the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will doesn't exceed the limits of what Adam can withstand, you won't go crazy here if you don't lose control there. Therefore, your most serious problem is that you have to maintain a normal connection with that body. Once it's interfered with, your condition will be in trouble. And this connection is actually very weak under Sapphira Castle's isolation effect. You deliberately showed a half-crazed state for 2 reasons. Other than luring me to find an opportunity in this direction and stepping on the trap you set up, you were also hiding this fact so that I won't be able to target this aspect while engaging in a battle with you. Of course, there are plenty of problems outside these ones. After all, you aren't fully prepared. If I had discovered these problems earlier, even if I was a king of angels with the uniqueness, there's no way for me to defeat you. Amon listened quietly and raised his hand to adjust the crystal monocle in his right eye. The corners of his lips curled up as he let out a sigh with a smile. Discover new stories on no/v/e/elbinin.com. Upon seeing this, Klein smiled and shook his head. You truly are powerful, cunning, and terrifying, truly worthy of the title of God of Deceit. If it wasn't for the fact that I had long considered what I would do when forced into a corner by you and had no other choice, I definitely would have hesitated just now. And if I hesitated slightly, I would have already died. In that case, Amon would completely control Sapphira Castle, preventing Klein from returning from the fog of history for a resurrection. Amon stared at the increasing number of sinister tentacles extending out from under Klein's dark-colored cloak. He slowly took a deep breath and said with a smile, "The Lord of the Mysteries in you is about to truly awaken." Klein's smile had a nerve-wracking feeling to it. You can also compete with me on this point. Our next battle is very simple. It's a competition of who awakens the Lord of the Mysteries will to a greater extent, a competition of whose control over Sapphira Castle is deeper. 50%, 70%, 90%, until we reach 100%. Then, with a bang, we explode and the heat returns. What do you think? Are you going to take the bet? Let's see who can't hold on any longer first. It's very thrilling, very interesting, and very suited to your preferences. It's like the roulette that's popular in Faysac. 2 people, each having a revolver and a bullet inside. They take turns pulling the trigger at their temples. Whoever gives up first results in his opponent winning. And if no one gives up and persists until the end, there won't be a winner. Heat will be the winner. Amon's brows pricked up as he smiled without saying a word. Klein looked at him and said with a smile, "Although you've always been pursuing thrills and unknown to be a risk-taker, you achieve your goals most of the time. Not only do you not lose much, you often gain a lot. And in the few failures that you do experience, you only lose some of your avatars and some items. You've never suffered any serious injuries or been placed in a desperate situation. Your every action is a product of meticulous planning. Even if you fail, you will have a way out. Does this mean that you value your life more than I imagined? You do like thrills and seek it for pleasure, but to do so regardless of the price is just an image you portray. How can a real God of Deceit wager a bet with himself at stake? Of course, this is just my own guess. Perhaps it's wrong. Anyway, do you want to take the bet?" Amon stroked the crystal monocle and made a TSK-like medici. "You're really crazy." Klein replied with a smile, "In the eyes of others, this is indeed insane. But to me, it's just a choice. Compared to you, I'm more willing to believe in the former Lord of the Mysteries. He is a true great old one, looking down on the universe from high above and treating most of the living beings as insects. This would make him distant to himself from reality. Besides, I should still have time to get the genie to be my witness. I'll get the Lord of the Mysteries to promise me certain things. To him, it's very simple and worthless." Having said that, the corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he said, "I won't lose too much, just myself. There are always some things that are more important than others." Amon maintained his smile but didn't say a word. Klein then surveyed the area and found the magic wishing lamp and Trunsoist brass book among the floating fragments of the wilderness. He immediately laughed out loud. "Look, I didn't get punished. This means that I'm not lying. I'm telling the truth. In fact, the law set up by the Trunsoist brass book had long been abolished since the Divine Kingdom was destroyed during the Star's descent. Later on, the Amons dared to attempt to use steel, but Klein's main goal wasn't to prove anything, but to show his determination, firmness, or perhaps madness. Of course, what he said was the truth. He was indeed willing to put them into practice. Otherwise, there was no way he could hide it from Amon or exert enough pressure on him. Amon smiled and said without a hint of panic, "Sounds interesting. Isn't it?" "Let's begin," Klein replied without hesitation as his eyes turned darker. Amorn's smile froze as his palms suddenly gathered together. Beneath his classical black robe, there were also slippery and sinister tentacles. His aura changed a little as his body seemed to have a dark cloak on it. At that moment, Amorn became more like the Lord of the Mysteries. However, he wasn't competing with Klein in the progression of the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries. Instead, he was using this to deceive Sapphira Castle to create a corresponding bug and creating a chance to escape. If the authority of the error were to take effect at the same level, it would often have different preconditions. First, the medium and target had to be similar enough. Second, there was a certain connection between the two. Third, there were certain logical contradictions between certain matters or objects. Fourth, some of the rules were indeed incomplete. Fifth, while not directly affecting the target, construct an erroneous environment as a divine kingdom. In this aspect, the restrictions of fooling were even fewer, but once an error satisfied the conditions, it would be difficult to defend against or terminate it. Amorn now wanted to take the initiative to disguise himself and satisfy the first category. This was similar to the invasion of a virus. First, it had to make the other party believe that they were on the same side to avoid detection and then paralyze any defenses to achieve their respective goals. When a fruit looked like a strawberry, smelled like a strawberry, tasted like a strawberry, then it would basically be considered as a strawberry. But in reality, there might be an exception. At this moment, Amorn's appearance resembled that of the Lord of the Mysteries. His aura was like the Lord of the Mysteries, and his powers were like the Lord of the Mysteries. His mental imprint was also similar to the Lord of the Mysteries. With the authority of an error, it would naturally make Sapphira Castle believe that he was the Lord of the Mysteries. Suddenly, Klein's damaged the full divine kingdom completely collapsed. The grand and ancient palace and the mottled table inside appeared. The greyish-white fog beneath Sapphira Castle rose and enveloped the space. The greyish-white fog split into two waves. They clashed fiercely in a particular spot, producing vortexes one after another. They tore open a gap that led to reality. The power of Sapphira Castle was at odds with itself in this second. It was as though it didn't know which Lord of the Mysteries to obey. Amorn's figure immediately vanished, using Dor's authority to rush out of Sapphira Castle. Just as he touched the edge, his body paused before being sent flying backward. At the fool's seat, the corners of Klein's lips curled up as he sat there. His glabella and the strange door of light around him became more obvious, as though they were corporeal. This released an immense convergence force that reached an unimaginable level. It was like an invisible hand that pulled Amorn back. Amorn's body suddenly split apart, transforming into countless selves. And in front of every Amorn, an illusory astral door appeared. Silently, the astral doors opened at the same time, but in the endless darkness behind the doors, slippery and sinister tentacles appeared, blocking Amorn's escape. At the tip of the tentacles, resplendent starlight lit up as they instantly enveloped the Amorns. The Amorns couldn't help but gather together, turning into a conceptual cluster. These concepts included, but weren't limited to, pointed hats, classical black robes, monocles, fate, time, keys, doors, bugs, and Trojan horses. Klein slowly stood up and smiled at the conceptualized Amorn, who was now in a passive state. You can also awaken the Lord of the Mysteries as well further, but this is different from death. It'll definitely affect the body at Adam's side. A conceptualized Amorn rapidly gained a physical form. He relied on the door authority to escape from his current state. The corners of his mouth curled into a smile, but he didn't respond to Klein. He seized this opportunity to use the error authority to deceive, using an avatar outside that he had prepared ahead of time. It could be used to replace him and swap places with him. This was similar to the swapping of marionettes in the seer domain, but at this level, the principles were different. It wouldn't be affected in most situations. However, Amorn still failed. He realized that his error authority had been forcefully suppressed. As Klein slowly got up, more slippery and sinister tentacles appeared around him. The smile on his face became more exaggerated. Right on the heels of that, Amorn's eyes glazed over and the smile on his face froze as the crystal monocle lost its luster. At the same time, the cold, bizarre mask on Klein's face squirmed. The blind stupidity effect. In the next second, he grafted himself to a certain concept in the cosmos, and he used his authority to influence the corresponding environment. The surrounding slippery tentacles aimed at Amorn like revolvers. In Amorn's eyes that were still glazed over, a supernova exploded. An unimaginable sea of scorching light surged out, shattering his monocle and drowning his body. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1387. Behind the endless curtain of darkness, in the darkness with aqueous light ebbing gently. A young man with black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and a thin face suddenly sat up as though he had experienced a nightmare. Dressed in a classic black robe, he stretched out his right hand, attempting to take out a crystal monocle from the void and wear it over his right eye. But this time, he didn't obtain anything. His right hand paused in midair for 2 seconds before he retracted it and pinched the right eye rim. At this moment, he heard a gentle but emotionless voice. To him, there's something more important than life. To you, apart from yourself, there's nothing worth caring about. When the matter develops to a point where one's life is put on the line, it would imply your loss. The corners of Amorn's mouth curled up as though he wanted to smile and reply, but he ultimately didn't say anything. The voice continued. Born as a mythical creature, your lack of normal anchors is also a problem. This makes you know what courage and sacrifice are, but it's hard for you to understand. Amorn's expression changed as he stood up from the slightly glistening darkness. He looked at the human-skinned glove that was thrown to the side before, but seemed to be very happy. He retracted his gaze and curled the corners of his lips. This seems very interesting. I plan to leave this place and enter the cosmos. That place is much more exciting than the real world. Perhaps I'll understand the 2 things you mentioned as a result of this. That's very dangerous. Once you enter the cosmos, and before I succeed, I won't be able to provide any help. However, this will let you avoid him at least, the calm and indifferent voice replied without any emotion. Amorn didn't say another word. He raised his hand and pinched his right eye rim and vanished from the endless shadow screen. In the ancient palace above the fog. As Amorn was completely obliterated under the power of a supernova, Klein couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. If he had a choice, he naturally didn't want to sacrifice himself to revive the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. He hoped to personally protect this world and seek out the meaning of life again. Of course, if he didn't have a choice, he wouldn't hesitate to awaken the celestial worthy. He was certain that he could do this, and Amorn was also aware of this. Therefore, he didn't force him, and only attempted to escape. In the battle just now, it had developed into a battle of courage towards the end. The one who wasn't afraid of true death would yield the absolute advantage. Clearly, Amorn wasn't prepared to sacrifice himself for this matter. After heaving a sigh of relief, Klein's face under the cold and bizarre mask suddenly grimaced. Under his translucent dark-colored cloak, the slippery and sinister tentacles that extended out were either hitting the ground or rising up high. It was completely out of his control. He could feel that the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body was rapidly waking up, and it seemed like he couldn't stop it. Even if Klein directly died with his will and relied on the powers of a miracle invoker to revive, he wouldn't be able to escape, as the Lord of the Mysteries also wielded the authority of miracles. Upstairs AT from N0/V/pound/co/M. At that moment, Klein recalled the words of Dark Angel Sasria, which was also from the ancient sun god. The primordial one had awoken in my body. In the next second, at the spot where Amorn's body had shattered, beams of light were pulled by a vague invisible form of gravity as they charged towards Klein. Some were worms of time with 12 rings, some were insects made of resplendent starlight, while some were just large numbers of light dots. Klein wanted to stop the Beyonder characteristics from fusing with him, but the increasingly powerful celestial worthies will prevented him from succeeding. His body swelled into a balloon and then suddenly became thin as paper. This repeated itself in an endless loop. The mask on his face became brighter and more bizarre. The slippery and evil tentacles that extended out from under his cloak increased and became more uncontrollable. One worm of time beyond a characteristic, one key of star beyond a characteristic, and 1. Klein's mind felt like he was being devoured by an invisible monster, producing excruciating pain. Finally, a pair of eyes, which seemed to be formed from pure starlight, formed from layers of illusory doors and crystal monocles, rushed towards Klein's face, straight for the mask's eye sockets. Almost at the same time, the strange door of light that was tainted with bluish blackness appeared on Klein's body again. Sapphira Castle! At that moment, Klein, Sapphira Castle, Door's uniqueness, and Error's uniqueness, all had a strong inclination to congregate. Once they fused together, the Lord of the Mysteries would completely awaken and complete his resurrection process. Klein suddenly used his right hand to cover half of his face. His entire body bent down as if he was fighting with another self. With the anchoring and image disruption from his anchors, Klein finally slowed down the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries' will, reducing the power of convergence by a little. The starlight eyes and the crystal monocle stopped in front of Klein's face, floating only a few centimeters in the air like planets revolving around the sun. Klein believed that he couldn't maintain this extreme imbalance for too long. Perhaps a few minutes or even dozens of seconds later, the convergence would continue without restraint, bringing about an unbearable change. Ha, this can be considered a form of fusion. Klein laughed in an unstable manner. Then, he fooled the Trunsoist brass book, allowing it to enter a sealed state and fly into the junk pile. Right on the heels of that, Klein left Sapphira Castle and arrived in the astral world formed from symbolism and authority. This place seemed similar to the cosmos. It was dark and vast, but in fact, there were many unique aspects to it. For example, even though there was a sun-like star hanging in the distance, emitting normal light and heat, if one tried to get close to it, without getting injured, one would realize that the astral world there was like a black curtain. The sun was directly painted with pastel colors, and there were a bunch of concepts and symbols surrounding it. Furthermore, the drawing of the sun wasn't that nice, like a child without any foundation in art casually scrawled about. It was both comical and frightening. From another perspective, this might be a manifestation of the chaos and madness that underlay everything. As soon as Klein entered, he immediately sensed invisible gazes. Some of them came from areas protected by the world barrier, while others came from broader areas with obvious malice. The corners of Klein's mouth couldn't help but curl up. He suddenly turned his head and looked outside the world barrier, raising his slippery and sinister tentacles. This pair of eyes that seemed forged from starlight and the crystal monocle also moved. All of a sudden, all the attention from the cosmos shrank back. Only the hand-drawn crimson moon was left hanging there as it flashed with light. Hava! Klein laughed as he came to a dark kingdom filled with night vanilla and slumber flowers. At the same time, the Evernight goddess appeared at the borders of the divine kingdom in a layered, star-speckled dress. Her face was covered in a translucent black veil. She didn't transform into her giant form as she looked at him at eye level before raising her right hand and revealing the bird-shaped, golden accessory. At the head of the bird-shaped, golden accessory, a series of illusory doors appeared in the bronze-like eyes, allowing a drop of colorless water that had a strong aura of eternal stillness to land on Klein's cold and bizarre mask. The will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings entered a state of eternal slumber. Likewise for a majority of Klein's consciousness. All he had was a tiny bit of lucidity. Under such circumstances, he made the mask retract, and he transformed the cloak into a black windbreaker. Then, he made the crystal monocle turn into a pair of black gloves, making the eyes forged from starlight to turn into a cane inlaid with star speckles. This was only a change in appearance, but it didn't change anything in reality. Once the two items were separated from Klein, they would return to their original state. Of course, if Klein stabilized himself, he could accommodate them and change their corresponding concepts and symbols over and over again, allowing them to change their forms forever. This can't be sustained for too long. It just delays the matter for a while. The Evernight goddess gently reminded him. If the river of eternal darkness's water is used repeatedly, the Lord of the Mysteries will awaken even faster. This is because he will trigger some unknown changes and adjust the hizzy condition. Similarly, the specialness of Sapphira Castle and my blessing will gradually be erased, allowing you to enter a state of eternal slumber. It was as though Klein wasn't discussing his own matters. He smiled and nodded. Got it. The Evernight goddess said in a tone that seemed to be comforting Klein's psyche. Regarding this matter, the method Amon used, and the actions he did had exceeded my expectations. He is indeed the true god of deceit. It's not that you have no chance at all in what comes next. You can first try to completely control Sapphira Castle and pull the will of the Lord of the Mysteries to enter a state of eternal slumber. In a dream, you can resist and fuse with him. I can bless you, but the most important thing is still left to you. Becoming a great old one doesn't have any rituals involved. No ritual can change the awakening of the primordial one's will, but the ancient sun god believes that the order to accommodate them can increase one's self-awareness to a certain extent, increasing the success rate of the matter. First become a sequence 0 of a pathway, then control and fuse with the Sapphira. Only then do you accommodate the other uniquenesses. That's the best order. Become a dual pathway true god and then controlling and fusing with the Sapphira is an order that isn't good or bad. Only fusing with the Sapphira at the final step will be the worst choice. Klein smiled and said, that's a good idea. As long as one wakes up, a Lord of the Mysteries will be born. This might be him or me. Yes, after completely controlling Sapphira Castle and entering a state of eternal slumber, I should be able to weaken the seal of the Western continent, creating a weak spot that allows one to enter and exit. The Evernight goddess didn't say a word when she heard Klein's words. Klein continued smiling. This is my choice. I had anticipated this day a long time ago. I will finally face him. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1388. The Evernight goddess nodded and didn't say anything else. She reached out her palm and grabbed a corner of the void and tugged lightly. A thin layer of a night curtain gently floated down, covering Klein's body as it silently seeped in. Klein silently took in the blessings from the dream for 2 seconds. He pressed his hand to his chest and bowed. He took 2 steps back and left the astral world. The Evernight goddess stood at the borders of the divine kingdom as she watched him leave. In the next second, Klein landed in the projection of the giant king's court in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. Then, like Amon, he walked to the edge of the grayish-blue door and raised his hand to create a blue illusory door. Through the door, Klein entered the forsaken land of the gods. Following the guidance of fate, he wandered straight to the peak of a mountain range. There was a huge crucifix erected there, one covered with a faint shadow. Klein stared at the shadow for a few seconds before sighing slightly. He bent down and picked up an ancient silver mirror that was placed near the huge cross. Then, he turned around and vanished from the forsaken land of the gods. At the same time, the Worms of Spirit, who didn't need to be on duty in Sapphira Castle, informed him of Queen Mystic's current location. Klein raised his hand and took out the magic wishing lamp from the junk pile. Using the ownership connection between it and Bernadette, he used another wandering to appear on a rather hidden island where Emerald City was. Bernadette was flipping through the latest album catalogue from Inties. Just as she sensed something, she saw German Sparrow hand her the magic wishing lamp. "Thank you," Klein said in a very normal voice. Bernadette pursed her lips as though she wanted to say something, but at that moment, her eyes flashed as though she had seen something and prophesied something. Hence, she silently reached out and took the magic wishing lamp. Klein then took out a metal cigar case that had signs of corrosion on its surface. "This is your payment." Even without the eye of mystery prying, Bernadette could sense that the iron cigar case was extraordinary. She could roughly guess what kind of corrosion had happened to it. Upstairs AT from N0/V/pound/co/M. However, she didn't choose to accept it because of that reason, but she suddenly felt that she had no reason to reject it. She hesitated for a moment before taking the iron cigar case. If he was still in a rather crazy state like before, Klein definitely would have smiled and said in an exaggerated manner the moment Bernadette hesitated, "This is a gift from Uncle. Take it." But now, he was only left with that last bit of lucidity. He had to put in a lot of effort to prevent himself from falling asleep and not having the impulse to act like a clown. After leaving Bernadette's Emerald City, Klein seized the opportunity to wander to Backland, to Dr. Aaron Sirius's home. Will Septin, who was sitting in a pile of toys, raised his head and looked at Dwayne Dantes in front of him. His tears suddenly streamed down as he choked. I finally feel the opportunity. He was referring to the opportunity for accommodating the fate pathway's uniqueness. Klein squatted down and said without any expression, I am here to help you accommodate it. I'll steal your childhood and youth and allow you to instantly grow up. Then, by relying on a level of above the sequences but below that of a great old one, I'll forcefully help you to accommodate the die of probability. Of course, that alone won't be enough. It will require an additional fooling and use of bug. The tears that Will Septin dripped down suddenly stopped. He muttered in astonishment, so the two choices are actually the same. Typically speaking, the accommodation of a pathway's uniqueness required one to be naturally born with it, seek an existence at the level of a great old one to help, or rely on a simplified advancement ritual to complete it. There was no other possibility. The snake of fate, Will Septin, clearly wasn't born with the uniqueness, and only had the two options left to consider. His focus had been on holding a simplified ritual, which was to wait for the opportunity of fate. Who knew that this opportunity was actually when Klein was approaching the level of a great old one? In essence, it was the second method. With this in mind, the chubby child, Will Septin, cried even harder. He felt as though he had been deceived by fate. Let the life school of thought's demigod send over the die of probability. Normally, with your luck, the die of probability should be by your side. Klein ignored Will's crying. Let's begin as soon as possible. I don't have much time left. Will stopped and looked at Klein for a moment before he said, slightly choking, forget it, let's wait for the next opportunity. Given your current state, it would be a huge burden for you to forcibly help me accommodate it. Perhaps you would lose control on the spot. I don't want to face the Lord of the Mysteries. Okay, next time. I have a premonition. With that said, Will looked into Klein's eyes and said, I have a feeling that the next opportunity will be better. Klein maintained his reverie-like expression as he said in a low voice, is this a prophecy? Will Septin's tears flowed again. No, it's a blessing. Klein nodded slightly, stood up, and took a step back. During this process, his figure gradually faded away and soon disappeared. He returned to Sapphira Castle and sat on the high-backed chair, allowing the greyish-white fog to envelop him. After surveying the area and confirming the states of the crimson stars, Klein leaned back in his chair in exhaustion and slightly raised his right hand. This time, he didn't create the fake world again. On the two sides of the long mottle table, crimson beams of light shot out at the same time, freezing into the members of the Tarot Club: the Hanged Man, the Sun, the Hermit, the Magician, and the rest. This sudden gathering was clearly beyond Audrey's and company's expectations. It left them surprised and alarmed. Before that, although they had come to Mr. Fool's Divine Kingdom on occasions that weren't a Monday afternoon, it was all planned. They knew in advance that they would be dragged here. They would have either applied for a mini-gathering in advance, avoid the full moon ravings, or treat Mr. World with psychological problems. It could be said that, apart from the first time, this was the second time they were summoned by Mr. Fool without any warning. This made even the slowest members of the club catch the hint of uneasiness and feel the air freeze. Thinking back to the World German Sparrow's visit and the words of Mr. Fool's blessed, Audrey, Alger, and Zio simultaneously had similar thoughts. Is it finally here? Audrey subconsciously turned her head and looked down at the bottom end of the long mottled table. There was no one there. Although she was already mentally prepared, Audrey couldn't help but be stunned as emotions of uncontrollable sadness surged within her. In her heart, the World German Sparrow's image had long since turned from a crazy adventurer and an extremely dangerous beyonder to a person who wore a cold and tough facade but was a gentle, powerful, loving, mysterious, and lonely man who was burdened with many friends on his back. She believed that amongst the Tarot Club members, she knew the world the best apart from Mr. Star. And now, this friend seemed to have encountered some misfortune, leaving behind only an empty seat. The Tarot Club lost its first official member. Where did Klein go? Leonard suddenly felt a little flustered. In this world, he was the only one he could befriend. Previously, when Klein suddenly appeared in the southern continent and threw the gold coin into the cathedral's donation box, Leonard had already had a strange premonition. He had the feeling that Klein was about to receive the judgment of fate and was bidding farewell to the past. This was the same as the time back in Tingen when they decided to step out together and face Megos. Old Man's recent silence has been a little bizarre. Could something really have happened to Klein? With Mr. Fool's level and status, as long as there's a chance, he should be able to be saved. Leonard's heart tightened as he suddenly turned his body and cast his gaze at Mr. Fool at the top end of the long wattle table. This mighty existence was still enveloped by the greyish-white fog, preventing others from seeing his condition. At this moment, Emlyn, Cat Lear, and Derek also discovered Mr. World's absence. Coupled with the suddenness of this gathering, they were both shocked and puzzled. They didn't know what had happened, but their instincts told them that it wasn't a good thing. As a clairvoyant who had recently advanced, Cat Lear even felt that there was a certain problem with Mr. Fool. Mr. World isn't here. Zio had previously mentioned that Mr. Fool and his few blessed were about to face a major challenge, and it's very likely that they would suffer a bad fate. Force was also somewhat alarmed, inevitably having a strong fear due to some unknown change. She had once thought that she would sigh in relief because of Mr. World's disappearance, but from the looks of it, it wasn't like that. Instead, she found her heart heavy and a little horrified. Only then did she realize that at some point in time, the world had become the pillar of support for the Tarot Club outside of Mr. Fool. It made everyone feel at ease when they saw him. Of course, some fear was unavoidable. As Justice Audrey and company turned around and looked at the top end of the long wattle table, Klein, who was already the real Fool, said in a low voice, "This is a last-minute gathering. Mr. Fool is very exhausted." Audrey, who sensed this, felt her heart tighten. She looked around and stood up as usual. After the members of the Tarot Club stood up one after another, Audrey lifted the ends of her skirt with a heavy heart and curtsied at the end of the long wattle table. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1389. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." The other members of the Tarot Club appeared rather solemn as they followed Miss Justice's usual greeting. After they sat down again, the Fool Klein surveyed the area and slowly said, "I will be entering a state of slumber." Upon hearing this, Alger, Audrey, Zio, and Force felt like their speculations had finally been confirmed. Leonard, Emlyn, Derek, and the other Tarot Club members felt their hearts sink as they became increasingly flustered and filled with puzzlement. Of course, they weren't that surprised. The abnormal last-minute gathering and the abnormality of the world's absence seemed to indicate that something important had happened today. Klein maintained his last bit of clarity and said in his previous tone, "This involves a war that's at the level of above the sequences. It has something to do with the apocalypse to a certain extent." Indeed. Alger acutely caught the words above the sequences. He had long suspected that there was another level above sequence 0, the one occupied by the ancient sun god when he had 8 kings of angels. Now, Mr. Fool had finally confirmed his guess and resolved many of his doubts. Cat Lear and company also noticed the hidden message in Mr. Fool's words. Those who had similar guesses like the Hanged Man felt enlightened, while the ones who had never had such guesses were inevitably surprised and confused when they heard it. However, they quickly combined what they had learned from the past and came to a realization. The Fool Klein continued, "Only after you become an angel do you have the right to know the exact situation. Otherwise, just understanding it will bring corruption." This made the Tarot Club members think of the words underground and cosmos. They were momentarily unable to contain their thoughts. Klein looked at the end of the long wattle table and said, "My blessed, the world has entered a deep slumber. It's unknown when he will wake up. Then what should be done?" Leonard nearly blurted out, but he could clearly sense that Mr. Fool hadn't finished his sentence. Therefore, he forcefully held back his urge. The Fool Klein swept his gaze across him. Visit novelbin.co/m for the latest updates. Next is a long-term commission for all members. Spread my name more widely, but don't clash with the Orthodox churches. When necessary, You can choose to use a more concealed method to proselytize. This will aid in my awakening. Also, spread the news of the world being my blessed and record it in the Church's Holy Bible. Of course, do not include information that involves his personal information. Remember one sentence: the awakening of the world spells the fool's return. Klein wanted to increase his number of anchors. This might be useful in the battle with the Lord of the Mysteries in his dream. At the same time, he wanted to mold the world into a saint of the Church of the Fool, an angel beside the divine throne, so that this image could also greatly share an image with the believers and obtain his own anchors. To put it simply, Klein planned on having a believer contribute 2 sets of anchors. After all, to him, be it the fool or the world, all of them were just an identity of his. Furthermore, the image created by anchors wouldn't be uniform. They were different and wouldn't affect him. At the level of the fool, the Church would spread the name of the deity, the fool's sacred emblem, and all kinds of religious teachings without any concrete images. As for the world, he had quite a number of identities, such as German Sparrow, Dwayne Dantes, and Merlin Hermes. It wouldn't fixate on a single image. The reward is the convenience you have enjoyed in the past, the responses you received, and the corresponding help given to your future prayers, the fool Klein said without a change in tone. After I begin my slumber, I can still respond to my prayers in a certain way, but not every time. If there's something very important that needs help, pray a few more times. He could tell from Antigonus's state of eternal slumber that dreams could be projected outside. As long as the correct method was used, a sleeping deity could make use of the dream to a certain extent to respond to prayers. Regarding this situation, the members of the Tarot Club weren't stumped by it at all. On the one hand, most of them were either openly or secretly spreading the faith of the fool. On the other hand, it was very common to pray to deities without receiving a response. Mr. Fool's responses from before were considered extremely rare. They had almost never heard of anything like this happening elsewhere. To be able to receive a response through repeated prayers on important matters was better than most of the clergymen of the Orthodox churches. Yes, Mr. Fool. The Tarot Club members didn't hesitate at all as they accepted the long-term commission. Among them, Leonard was the one that answered from the bottom of his heart. He was most eager and impatient. To him, spreading the faith and biblical canon of Mr. Fool was to awaken Klein. This made him instantly find the motivation to do something else other than his usual work. At this moment, the fool Klein nodded slightly and cast his gaze at Katlia. The previous commission to gather all the information regarding the hidden sage suddenly coming to Litha is still effective. If you wish to take the risk, then go further and investigate the present state of the hidden sage. This will be very dangerous. You can reject it, and the reward is a wish. Katlia thought for a moment and said, "Honorable Mr. Fool, is this related to awakening you? Is it related to surviving the apocalypse? Perhaps, perhaps not. I can't give you a definite answer right now. I just see some visions." This time, Klein didn't deliberately create a high-level persona of the fool, because he was already the fool. Also, watch over all your subordinates that are beyond us of the earth and moon pathway. Katlia fell silent for a moment before slowly saying, "I'll accept this commission." The fool Klein cast his gaze to the other side and said to Derek, "Your mission is to protect the new city of Silver and New Moon City and protect the Rorsted Archipelago. The more believers I have and the safer they are, the higher the chances of me waking up. On this foundation, think about how to expand the church and spread the faith. Your payment is to become my blessed." Derek's eyes suddenly burned as he recalled the encouraging gaze he had received from the chief when he pushed open the final door of the giant king's court. He took a deep breath and said in a firm tone, "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein nodded and looked at Force. "You need to protect the Abraham family well to prevent them from suffering the temptation of the cosmos. Also, gather more information regarding the fourth epoch and figure out Mr. Dawes' condition at that time. Uncover some of the latent problems of the Abraham family. That's something I wish to do." Force hesitated for a moment, but she still expressed that she would do such things even if she wasn't given the commission. The fool Klein didn't give his approval or disapproval. Instead, he said, "If you're willing, you can write down biographies and stories of the world's different identities using different aliases. The reward for above is that when you have a chance of becoming a planeswalker and have to head to the cosmos, you will receive my blessings. Although Klein knew that he could use a dream to give a response to a certain extent in his sleep, he wasn't sure if he was the one who had the upper hand or the Lord of the Mysteries. Therefore, he wished to use verbal contracts of providing a reward after the completion of a mission on more important matters. When the time came, even if he was at a disadvantage, he would be able to make use of this sort of invisible promise to give an ingenious response. Planeswalker? Force was taken aback. To be frank, she had never considered this problem before. What she was worried about was the digestion of the secret sorcerer potion and the wanderer ritual. Soon, she composed herself and said, "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein then cast his gaze at Emling. The besiegement of the Rose School of Thought involves preparations for the apocalypse. It's rather dangerous. Even if an angel is participating in it, you have to pay attention to your own safety. Your commission is to try your best to gather blessings, auras, and items given by the primordial moon to her believers in the Rose School of Thought. These might be more dangerous than a Grade 1 sealed artifact. At that moment, although Klein still maintained the fool's tone, there were hints that resembled a friend's warning. This made Audrey, who had stabilized her initial mental state, sense something different. Recalling what Mr. Fool had said to the other members, she sighed inwardly. Mr. Fool's humanity seems to have become richer just as he is about to enter a deep sleep. While Emlyn was slightly surprised and puzzled, Klein continued, "Apart from participating in the besieging of the Rose School of Thought's mission, I hope that you can form a pharmaceutical company and perform research on how to mass-produce the medicine with magical effects. If it's mass-produced, there's no way the products can be equipped with a magical effect," Emlyn replied instinctively. The Fool Klein nodded. "Seek out a compromise. Your main goal is to spread my name through this pharmaceutical company. The reward will also be a wish. This isn't a matter of danger, but whether it's possible. The simplest solution is to give me 1,000 apothecary potions. I can form an apothecary factory for mass production." Emlyn mumbled inwardly before replying seriously, "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein looked to the other side and said to Zio, "The apocalypse is approaching. Be it the Red Priest or the Demoness pathways, they will become active. Your mission is to rely on the official factions to investigate the whereabouts of the 3 Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics and the uniqueness of the Red Priest pathway. If there's a chance, find a clue to confirm the primordial Demoness present condition. It's very dangerous." Klein didn't mention the payment because he had already paid for it. Zio had her wish fulfilled by holding a ritual and becoming a sequence for Imperative Mage. As for the 3 Sequence 1 Conqueror Beyonder characteristics of the Red Priest pathway, Klein had previously learned that one was in the hands of the Sauron family, the former Inti's royal family, the other in the hands of the Faceax Einhorn royal family, and the other was in the hands of the Lund's Augustus royal family. Later, as a reward, it was given to the Demoness sect. Of course, this was only a preliminary answer. The corresponding situation could very well have changed. The Sauron family had already been in decline since Razel's era. It might not necessarily be able to keep the Conquerors beyond a characteristic or corresponding sealed artifact under its control. Klein even suspected that it might have been obtained by the Iron and Blood Cross Order. The failure of the war had significantly damaged the Einhorn family. Klein didn't rule out the possibility of the death of a high-level angel or the loss of a Grade 0 sealed artifact. The location of the Conqueror Beyonder characteristic that the Augustus family gave to the Demoness sect was currently the clearest. However, Klein knew that the Red Angel evil spirit, Sauron Einhorn Medici, had been eyeing it all this time. Perhaps he had succeeded, or perhaps he was carrying out whatever plans he had. There were no clues to the corresponding Red Priest uniqueness at the moment. The last time the mysterious world knew of it was at the end of the 4th Epoch, during the Pale Disaster. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1390. Zio had always been looking forward and uneasy as to what her mission was. She looked forward to it because she had already chosen to accept Mr. Fool's gift, so she definitely had to pay the corresponding price. Knowing the mission earlier allowed her to prevent unnecessary second-guessing due to the unknown, guesses that only led to greater fear. She was uneasy because she knew that the remuneration she received was too generous. She believed that the final mission wouldn't be simple and would definitely be filled with danger. At that moment, after hearing Mr. Fool's words, her heart finally settled. At the same time, she secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Investigating the 3 sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics and the uniqueness of the Red Priest pathway and their locations, and even confirming the present state of the primordial demonis was indeed very dangerous. It was a mission that would result in a terrifying corruption if she wasn't careful, but it was at least better than snatching the uniqueness and sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics or directly facing the primordial demonis. If it were the latter, even with the official faction supporting her, Zio didn't think that she could accomplish it. All she could do was write a will, ready to sacrifice herself at any moment. And if it was just the former, she could use a more roundabout method to obtain the information. She didn't need to encounter powerful existences with high statuses. As a sequence for demigod, Zio was confident. Without any hesitation, she immediately replied, "Yes, Mr. Fool." The fool Klein had planned on looking to the other side. After some consideration, he added, "Be careful of Banzi." Without waiting for the Tarot Club members to start making connections, Klein said to Leonard, "Your mission is similar to the moon's. During the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought, gather blessings, auras, and items from the Mother Tree of Desire from their members. It's equally dangerous." He only gave a single warning, without saying as much as he did like when he gave Emlyn the mission. This was because Leonard had a senior angel from the Marauder pathway parasitizing him. He knew many secrets and knew how dangerous the outer deities were. He wouldn't allow Leonard to act recklessly. Seeing that Leonard was about to nod, the fool Klein maintained his tone and continued, "You don't have to do too much in promoting my name. You can even choose not to do it. As one of the 22 high-ranking members of the Church of Evernight, as one of the few high-ranking deacons of the Nighthawks, it was very easy for something to happen if Leonard spread the faith of the fool in private. He would be misunderstood by his colleagues and cause unnecessary conflicts." Miraculously, to Klein, the Moon Emlyn's actions didn't seem to be misunderstood in the same way. To the people and Sanguine around him, anything he did wasn't too strange. That's right. Leonard had already recovered from his previous eagerness and realized the cruelty of reality. However, he still wanted to do something. At this moment, the fool Klein added, "You can share the stories of the world with songs and poetry." Songs and poetry. Leonard instinctively frowned. He didn't immediately respond to Mr. Fool. Klein then said, "Other than that, try your best to raise your own level to prepare for the apocalypse. The reward for all the missions is a wish." Although many Beyonder characteristics had fallen into the real world when the god of combat died, bringing with them a batch of Beyonder creatures, mutated monsters, and abnormal lands, Klein didn't know how many Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics the Evernight goddess had obtained from the warrior pathway other than the uniqueness, but at the very least, a number of the Sequence 2 angels of the Church of Evernight had the possibility of becoming a Sequence 1 angel. At the same time, if they had obtained additional Beyonder characteristics, they could still switch to the corresponding sequence of the death pathway. This would open a path for the saints to advance, not limiting them to just one pathway. Of course, not every Sequence 3 saint wished to become an angel, but Leonard was currently only a sequence for Night Watcher. Furthermore, if the corresponding Sequence 3 Horror Bishop position was limited, he could consider Silver Knight, and Ferryman Klein had one set of the former. Leonard fell silent for 2 seconds before he slowly exhaled. "Yes, Mr. Fool." The fool Klein immediately cast his gaze at Miss Justice, who had been waiting. "Apart from promoting my name, you have 2 missions. One is to assist judgment and investigate the whereabouts of the Red Priest pathway's uniqueness and Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics, confirming the present state of the primordial demoness. The other is to work hard to raise your level. One of the missions is to increase my sequence." Audrey was somewhat puzzled about this mission. In her opinion, this seemed to be telling an ordinary person, "Your mission is to earn even more money." Furthermore, this isn't of any value to Mr. Fool. Could it be that he wants me to treat Mr. World? Just as this thought flashed across Audrey's mind, the fool Klein added, "The higher your sequence, the more opportunities you have to awaken the world. In this aspect, you can make use of external forces to help. The psychology alchemists that Hermes rebuilds will be one of the choices, but you need to be careful and take precautions. You have to pay a certain price for this. You can give up the reward you received before. This depends on your will and thoughts." Audrey no longer had any doubts. After a moment of silence, she nodded solemnly. "Yes, Mr. Fool." Klein's gaze landed on Alger. "You will know what your mission is in time to come." Klein had already foreseen the corresponding scene. Without waiting for Alger to speak, he continued, "You can bring the sea god scepter, but during this period of time, all the prayers of the sea god believers will be transferred to the sun, directly pointing at me." Although Alger still couldn't accurately guess what his mission was, he already had a vague premonition. After a moment of thought, he replied in an upright manner, "Yes, Mr. Fool." Visit novelbin.co/m for the latest updates. Klein retracted his gaze and looked around before slowly saying, "After this, on the first Monday afternoon of every month, you can still gather here, but there will be no convener. If you need to do a private, mini discussion, pray in advance and wait for a response." At this point, the fool Klein closed his eyes and said, "Let us end today's gathering here." The Tarot Club members couldn't help but feel a baffling sense of sorrow. It was as though a grand ball was coming to an end. They stood up at the same time and solemnly bowed towards the end of the long, mottled table. "Your will is our will." Klein waited until they finished speaking before he dispelled his control of them. He watched as the crimson starlight scattered and quickly fell. After staring at the scene for a few seconds, he conjured a yellowish parchment and a dark red fountain pen. After some thought, Klein simply wrote, "Dear Mr. Azik, due to some complicated reasons, I might be sleeping for a long time. I'm sorry, but I might not be able to write a letter to you for a long time." With just that sentence, Klein stopped and made the pen disappear. Although he had conjured that piece of paper, with his current status, level, and strength, he could sustain it for more than 100 years even if it was brought to the outside world. He closed his eyes again, summoned Azik's copper whistle, and blew it. At the same time, he released some of the restrictions that came from Sapphira Castle. The skeleton messenger appeared, and every bone in its body trembled intensely as if it would collapse at any moment. If not for the letter that Klein had handed over, it might have prostrated itself. After the skeleton messenger received the letter and left Sapphira Castle in a hurry, Klein rubbed his temples. This wasn't because the will of the celestial worthy had already escaped from his state of eternal slumber, nor was it because of the pain from maintaining his lucidity, it was just a habit. Klein slowly leaned back into his chair and sighed. On both sides of the long, mottled table, Justice Audrey, the Hanged Man Alger, the Sun Derek, the Magician Force, the Moon Emlyn, the Hermit Catlear, the Star Leonard, and Judgment Zio appeared in the order they joined the Tarot Club. But this time, they weren't real. They were only projections. They no longer appeared blurry, revealing their images from Klein's memory. Soon after, more figures appeared. They were a mature man with a receding hairline with deep eyes, a beautiful witch with blue eyeshadow and red blush, a middle-aged man with black hair mixed with silver hair, his voice unusually loud and sonorous, a woman in her late 40s with ear-length short hair, a youth that gamed on his phone while eating delicacies, a happy young lady who kept giggling, a civil servant who looked old than his age with a high hairline, a young girl dressed in an old-fashioned skirt who focused on machinery, a doll-like lady with a pale face, a teacher with soft facial features and bronze skin, a child licking on ice cream, the madam holding for heads, and an elder looking all serious at a bill. They either sat or stood, gathering beside the people they knew. In the flickering candlelight on the long table, they discussed different things, followed the music, and danced. Klein silently watched the lively scene as his expression gradually softened. After an unknown period of time, he stood up, passed through them, and walked into the depths of this space. Behind him, the figures, the candlelight, and the music faded away and disappeared. When he saw the strange door of light above the greyish-white cloud, Klein beckoned for the magic mirror, a Rhodes. At that moment, the transparent or opaque worms and insects that clustered together to form spherical lights in the strange door of light turned bluish-black. It was like a thick layer of fog that made one unable to see what was behind the door. After Klein arrived, he didn't immediately enter. He felt as though there was an extremely terrifying monster behind the door, waiting to devour him. He raised his head and looked at the transparent cocoons hanging above the door of light. He looked at the modern humans with different skin colors inside the cocoons. Closing his eyes to sense them, Klein raised his right hand and closed his 5 fingers. The cocoons cracked open as the people inside transformed into specks of light. They flew out of Sapphira Castle and landed in the real world, into the bodies of those who had just died. After doing this, Klein lowered his head and looked at the magic mirror in his hand. "Are you scared?" The aqueous light on the surface of the ancient silver mirror swirled and the pale words outlined itself. "No." In the next second, Rhodes raised his own question according to the rules. "Great Master, are you afraid?" The corners of Klein's mouth twitched. "Yes." With that said, he took a step forward with the magic mirror in hand and walked towards the bluish-black fog in the middle of the strange door of light, passing through it. His figure disappeared behind the door that had the unknown hidden behind. The cracked cocoons were still gently swaying. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1391. In the dark blue waves that seemed to never stop in the Berserk Sea, the future was like a leaf, being thrown high up at times and smacking down at other times. In these waters, there were still some pirate ships that were cruising. They were used to such situations and felt that it was as natural as the sun rising. After Catley returned to the real world, she pondered for a moment before spreading open a piece of paper and writing. Find the newest novels on n/o/velbin.com. She wanted to ask the Queen what happened recently. In fact, before Mr. Fool announced that he would enter deep sleep, Catleya had already sensed the impending monumental change. Whether it was the sudden closing of the doors or the meteor shower streaking across the sky to illuminate the world, it gave her some inspiration as a clairvoyant, allowing her to see some blurry visions. Of course, she was limited by her own level, position, and status. She didn't have enough knowledge of what had happened, and she was unable to grasp what exactly had caused Mr. Fool to choose to sleep. All she could do was ask Queen Mystic Bernadette, who had long advanced to the level of an angel and led a mysterious organization while being in control of many powerful sealed artifacts. Just as Catleya summoned the messenger and took out the letter she had written, she was taken aback. At that moment, a purple light was accentuated in her eyes. It became extremely saturated and slowly flowed like a river. She felt that Mr. Fool had entered a deep sleep. Unconcealable hesitation, confusion, and sadness arose in the Admiral of Star's heart. For some reason, she felt an inexplicable palpitation, and 2 drops of tears unknowingly slid down her face. She seemed to understand something, yet nothing. She only knew that it was unknown how much time it would take for Mr. Fool to wake up from his slumber. Taking off the heavy glasses on her nose bridge, Catleya wiped the corners of her eyes, allowing her emotions to return to normal. She walked to the window and looked at the deck. Frank Lee warmly invited the crew to taste his newly brewed beer, but none of the pirates dared to try it. Thankfully, I sent Sea Elf to the Queen ahead of time. Now, all I need to do is watch over Frank. Without Mr. Fool's watch, I have to be more careful and pay more attention to him. Yes, I have to find something for Frank to do other than research. He's a first mate, so he can't always be working on something else. Catleya thought with a heavy expression. After considering how to deal with Frank, as well as how to reorganize the small number of pirates from the Earth and Moon pathway onto other ships, and not frequently interact with Frank, Catleya focused her focus on the Hidden Sage. Although she was already one of the 10 pillars of the Moses ascetic order, due to her background and the influence of the Hidden Sage, she had never received the trust of the president and the other higher-ups. She could only be an ostracized person who teetered on the periphery of the organization, who had her own circle and respective faction. From a certain perspective, her relationship with the Moses ascetic order was closer to that of a partner. On the one hand, she needed a faction and a powerhouse to project her will over the 5 seas. On the other hand, she yearned to obtain corresponding knowledge and materials. And to obtain the information regarding the hidden sage that represented a deity suddenly coming to life and confirming his current state would necessarily require her to become a core member of the Moses ascetic order. With my present identity, there's no problem with me participating in the internal decisions of the Moses ascetic order. Only by truly participating in these will I be able to come into contact with more information and elevate my own status. However, this will be rather dangerous. Even if the hidden sage condition isn't right and doesn't interfere with the Moses ascetic order's operations, the other higher-ups will also be subjected to the infringement of interests and be in constant suspicion. They will counterattack to a certain degree. There are at least 2 of the 10 pillars that I can't see through, making me instinctively feel danger. And confirming the state of the hidden sage will be even more dangerous. If anything goes wrong, I'll immediately be corrupted and eroded by him. The more Katlia thought about it, the more she felt that the mission given by Mr. Fool was difficult. She had always been teetering at the periphery of the Moses ascetic order with her identity as a pirate. In fact, she had her worries about this matter. She was afraid that if she went too deep into the organization's internal affairs, it would expose the fact that she was still in contact with Queen Mystic. She was afraid that the other 10 pillars would one day suddenly point her out as a spy and eliminate her on the spot. At that moment, Katlia even wanted to abandon Mr. Fool's mission and identity as one of the 10 pillars of the Moses ascetic order. She wished to return to the dawn and return to the Queen's side. That way, she wouldn't need to worry about this matter anymore. If there were any problems, the Queen would be able to stop them. Ever since she left the dawn, she had to shoulder everything by herself. Katlia had always felt exhausted as her shoulders remained heavy. However, this thought was quickly given up by Katlia. She sighed softly. She understood that she would never be able to return to the time when she was a little girl without worries. She wasn't only responsible for her own life, but also the fate of Frank, Heath, Nina, and the other crew members. Furthermore, she had predicted the arrival of the apocalypse. She hoped that she could become the Queen's most powerful helper and do something for this world. Katlia closed her eyes and muttered to herself, then face it. To truly integrate into the Moses ascetic order and gather the relevant information. After making this decision, Katlia no longer concealed her strength. She raised her hands and used her fairy tale magic. In the eyes of the surrounding pirate ship crew, the future and its fleet became illusory at the same time, turning into countless bubbles. The bubbles reflected a dreamy color under the light's illumination. Then, they slowly melted into the sea. Just like that, the future and its fleet disappeared from everyone's eyes. Many knowledgeable pirates were first shocked and stunned. Then, they had a thought. A new queen over the seas has been born. Queen of Stars. Backland, in a particular house. Zio, who had yet to sort out her thoughts after returning to the real world, saw Force figure appear in front of her as she shouted, "That mission of yours is too dangerous." Zio was taken aback as she instinctively pointed out a problem. "You didn't knock." This was the worst part of living together with a demigod of the apprentice pathway. Force first reflected on herself for a second before confidently saying, "You didn't close the door." She pointed at the ajar bedroom door. "I actually didn't close the door." "That's right." This was a last-minute gathering. I wasn't prepared for it before the matter. Zio opened her mouth, but she couldn't say a word. Both of them looked at each other speechlessly for a long time, but none of them broke the silence. Finally, Force decided to forget the accusation and focused on the mission itself. A mission that involves Sequence 1 and a uniqueness is too dangerous. With that said, she recalled that Zio had already accepted Mr. Fool's gift. Her eyes reddened uncontrollably as she couldn't help but mumble, "Remember to get my help. At the very least, I can help you escape." To them, the things they experienced before had involved very few matters at the Sequence 1 level. Apart from Mr. Fool and the World German Sparrow, at most it was them being watched by he who must not be named. At other times, they would at most do trivial matters at the periphery of corresponding matters. They had never faced an enemy that could be addressed as him. Therefore, when she thought of how her friend's mission involved sequence 1 beyond a characteristic, or even a uniqueness and true deity, Force couldn't help but feel nervous and worried. Zio smiled and said, "I'm just seeking clues and investigating the truth. It's not like I need to face them directly." She paused for a second and said, "The apocalypse is approaching. We have to do something. Look, even Mr. Fool has fallen into a deep sleep. What's more, trivial figures like us. If I didn't quickly become a demigod, perhaps there's nothing I can do. Now, there's at least some hope. At the very least, I can try to awaken Mr. Fool." Force had experienced many things and had long understood this principle. She had only been venting her emotions, but now she had calmed down. She thought for a moment and said, "What are you going to do next?" "Just relying on myself to investigate it will definitely be very difficult. I'll definitely need to use MI9's intelligence network. I plan on finding a suitable opportunity to let them know that I'm a sequence for demigod. In order to not be suspected, I might need Miss Justice to give me some hints and make some arrangements," Zio answered seriously. Force's thoughts raced. "I'll come up with a script for you. I'll act as an antagonist and simulate a lunatic who attempted to advance to sequence for Imperative Mage and then be defeated by you." As she spoke, a story took form. She immediately sat beside Zio's desk, took out a pen and paper, and started writing. "After I write up the story, I'll get Miss Justice to make some amendments and make it appear reasonable," Force said as she wrote. As a secret sorcerer, there was no doubt that she could prevent their conversation from leaking out. Zio thought for a moment and said, "Isn't your most important task now to write the biographies and stories?" That's simple. I've already thought of plenty of scenes, and there's a lot of material on my mind." "No, nothing of that sort." After muttering a few words, Force placed all her focus on writing a script for Zio so as to gain MI9's approval. Seeing her good friend focused on her matter, a smile gradually appeared on Zio's face. She then cast her gaze to the ajar door and heard her brother, Diodorica, seemingly reciting the ancient Fasak words. This was a requirement for studying law to become a lawyer. Their mother was instructing 2 servants to clean up the living room. Their voices reached Zio's ears, and her expression gradually became firm. Although she had no idea what would happen when she faced the MI9 brass, and even though she would encounter unknown dangers when completing Mr. Fool's mission, as well as the unknown future during the dawn of the apocalypse, Zio knew that if she didn't do anything or take on certain risks and just enjoyed the pleasant times with her family just like that, she would ultimately be drowned by the floods like most people who were unprepared. And now, there was at least a path filled with brambles, one that had a glimmer of light at the end of it. It needed the realization of sacrifice, and to grasp it with courage. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1392. In a room beside the Evernite Cathedral in the southern continent, East Balam, Leonard's consciousness returned to the real world. After a few seconds of silence, he picked up the cup of coffee that had turned cold and took a sip. The bitter taste filled his mouth, gradually waking his mind up. "Old man, what happened today?" Finally, Leonard couldn't help but ask. After a moment of silence, Palace Zoroast replied wistfully, "Error has perished." Error? Leonard almost didn't realize which existence Old Man was referring to. In the next second, he couldn't hide his astonishment as he nearly forgot to whisper, "Amorn?" This was a standard true god. Yes. Palace Zoroast's voice sounded like he had aged considerably. To be precise, Amorn's main body perished. Leonard wasn't in the mood to distinguish the subtle meaning behind Old Man's words. He asked in disbelief, why was there no sign of it? He had witnessed the phenomena before and after the god of combat died. He knew that it was a change that would affect the entire world and bring about many terrifying monsters and dangerous regions. And just now, the only 2 abnormalities were the doors and windows suddenly closing and him seemingly forgetting something. In reality, the latter wasn't strange at all. Most people would encounter something similar during their daily lives. Palace Zoroast's tone sank. He should have perished in Sapphira Castle. Sapphira Castle? Leonard was shocked. The venue of the gathering he had just attended was inside Sapphira Castle. A war between gods has just erupted there. Amorn actually infiltrated Sapphira Castle? Amidst Leonard's thoughts, his expression gradually turned solemn. Old man, Mr. Fool was injured because of this and had no choice but to enter a state of slumber. Is he about to enter a state of slumber? Pallas Zoroaster asked in return. He didn't seem to be too surprised about this. Leonard tersely acknowledged. The reason he'd summoned us today was because of this matter. Pallas Zoroaster fell silent for a few seconds before saying, his choice to enter a state of slumber is indeed related to the previous battle of gods and Amorn's infiltration, but it's not because of injuries, but because of corruption. Corruption? Leonard blurted out in surprise. Even at Mr. Fool's level, irreversible corruption can still be encountered by him? Pallas Zoroaster regained his previous poignant tone. Everything has godhood. By relying on godhood to become a powerhouse, one can never escape the shackles of godhood. On this point, it's the same for you and me. Likewise for the Fool. Perhaps he shouldn't be called the Fool anymore. He is equivalent to half a Lord of the Mysteries. Lord of the Mysteries. Regarding the problem of the mental imprint in a beyond a characteristic, Leonard indeed had a deeper understanding of it than demigods at his level. However, he still had several holes in the knowledge on this matter. Even though he had heard Old Man mention the term Lord of the Mysteries, he didn't understand what it meant. However, at present, he could confirm that Mr. Fool's level had transcended sequence 0 according to Mr. Fool's words during the gathering, and what Old Man had just said, his strength was enough to kill a true god. Leonard cleverly didn't probe further. He changed the topic in a deep voice. Old Man, why is Klein sleeping as well? Are you able to wake him up as soon as possible? Pallas Zoroaster's tone was somewhat odd. How could an old and weak angel like me know about matters at the level of gods? As for the awakening, even the Fool has no better solution, much less me. Leonard remained silent for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup and took another sip. After a while, he asked hesitantly, Old Man, do you have any way of stealing the artistic flair of others? Pallas Zoroaster scoffed. The definition of artistic flair is vague with no clear categorization. There's no way to steal it. However, if you change it to natural talent, there's a way. Forget it. Leonard ultimately couldn't do anything about stealing the natural talent of others to help him resolve his problem. Pallas Zoroaster added with a smile, if you can't accept this method, then you can find a natural talent that you want of someone who's very poor. Make a deal with him and give him the money he wants to exchange for the corresponding natural talent. It's a little like a deal with the devil. Leonard commented objectively. Pallas Zoroaster chuckled and said, there's another simple solution. That is to spend money to hire naturally talented people to help you resolve the corresponding problems. Old Man, why didn't you say so earlier? Leonard instantly saw hope. Pallas Zoroaster scoffed. You didn't manage to think of something that simple? I thought you had eliminated this option before consulting me. Leonard ignored Old Man's mockery. After some serious thought, he felt that this idea was indeed feasible. However, he soon felt a little guilty and uneasy, as if he was avoiding his responsibility. Regarding this matter, I still have to do something personally. Apart from inviting someone to write songs and poems, I have to write a little. With this in mind, Leonard suddenly stood up and walked to the door. Where are you going? Pallas Zoroaster asked in surprise. Leonard frowned slightly as he said firmly, I'm going to the nearby bookstore to buy some poem anthologies. Ever since he advanced to Nightmare, he had given up the collection of poems he had bought in the past, making most of them nothing but decorations. When he became a spirit warlock, he began to collect poem anthologies that were suitable for some spirits to read, allowing him to chant the appropriate parts in a battle to create beyonder effects that worked in concert with him. Therefore, when he came to the southern continent, he didn't bring a single poem anthology book. He only remembered a few of those that he often used in the past. I never expected that, after becoming a high-ranking deacon, I would need to read poem anthologies again. Leonard sighed inwardly as his steps became firmer. Pallas Zoroast had never imagined that Leonard's next step would be to buy poem anthologies. After a while, he probed, "Is this an order from the fool?" "Yes, for promoting the corresponding legendary stories," Leonard answered simply as he opened the door and walked out. Pallas Zoroast fell silent once again before saying, "Apart from writing poems, you have to pay more attention to the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought." Leonard walked down the stairs and entered the streets. He looked at the pedestrians and nodded gently. Yes. At that moment, as he walked towards the bookstore, he felt as though he had returned to Tin Gen, back to the time when he was still a midnight poet. At that time, he had also walked along the bustling streets, preparing to buy a copy of classical poems anthology of the Lund Kingdom and selected poems of Roselle Backlund, at the Harvest Church south of the bridge. After Emlyn White regained his senses, he found himself standing in front of a window. The sun was already dim outside, and the flowers were flourishing. His feelings towards Mr. Fool's slumber were slightly different from the other Tarot Club members. Other than heaviness, poignancy, sadness, and confusion, there was also the confidence that things would end well. Internally within the Sanguine, some of the marquises and earls were rather old. Even though they lived longer than most demigods at the same level, they were still in advanced stages of their lives. At this time, they often chose to sleep and use similar methods to extend their lifespans. The effects were pretty good. 7 Seton of LB/N.C/OM for latest novels. Therefore, Emlyn had long been accustomed to matters regarding slumbers. He knew that it wasn't equivalent to passing away, nor was it equivalent to perishing. He believed that if the correct solution was found, Mr. Fool would have a high chance of waking up. He looked out the window and muttered to himself, "Mr. Fool has entered a state of slumber, and the ancestor's revelation is often interfered with. It's obvious that she can't provide help frequently." After a brief silence, Emlyn sighed silently. "Indeed. In the end, I have to face it myself and bear it. This is the destiny of the Messiah." At the mention of the word Messiah, Emlyn clearly smiled with a self-deprecating hint. He then repeated inwardly, "I can only rely on myself." Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Father Utravsky's voice sounded behind Emlyn. "Time to set off." Emlyn turned his head and saw a huge sword on the back of the priest dressed in brown priest robes. The sword's length exceeded Emlyn's height, and its width was close to his waist. Together with Father Utravsky's hill-like body, the terrifying pressure felt corporeal. As a sanguine earl, Emlyn recovered from his stifled feeling and nodded gently. Okay. Today, they would head to the southern continent to participate in the besiegement of the Rose School of Thought. Just as he replied, Emlyn suddenly recalled something and hurriedly said, "Wait for half a day." He wanted to gather most of the Sanguine in Backlund to discuss the pharmaceutical company. Bishop Utravsky didn't ask anything and nodded. "Come find me when you're ready." After watching Father Utravsky enter the depths of the cathedral, Emlyn turned his head to the Sanguine that were following him to the southern continent. "Inform all the Sanguine in Backlund to come over. There's something we need to discuss." "Yes, Lord Earl," the Sanguine replied respectfully. After they split up, Emlyn turned his head to look at the altar and the sacred emblem of life in front of the cathedral. It was a simply drawn infant that was surrounded by symbols like wheat, flowers, spring water, and other symbols. This made Emlyn's thoughts suddenly turn adrift. He had forgotten when he started spending less time in his bedroom, spending less time with his dolls. Even his hobby of studying history became more targeted and efficient. This change didn't take form in an instant. Instead, it was slowly formed over time. It was something that made it difficult for others to notice. By the time Emlyn discovered it, he had already adapted to this new life. Emlyn retracted his gaze, raised his chin slightly, and shook his head with a smile. This is the destiny of the Messiah. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1393. After returning to the real world, Alger patiently waited for the mission Mr. Fool had mentioned. On this day, he, wearing the pontiff's clothes and the silver-black mask, was discussing the internal affairs of the Church of the Sea God with Oracle Danitz when he suddenly saw a bishop enter. Your Holiness, the Church of Storms has sent 2 gifts to congratulate you on becoming a proxy of God. The bishop held a tin box and bowed respectfully. Danitz, who had been secretly rejoicing over the malfunction of Byam's telegram, blurted out in surprise, "Where's that messenger?" "He left after leaving the present," the bishop at the door answered helplessly. Although the members of the Church of Storms often had impulsive moments, such behavior was still quite rare. Alger nodded slightly and said, "If they don't view us as enemies, sending a messenger to deliver a gift is enough." With that said, he raised his right hand and gently made the tin box in the bishop's hand fly over. After catching the small box, Alger's action suddenly slowed down as though he found it heavy. He slowly opened the container and saw a book made of yellowish-brown goatskin. On the surface of the book, there was a line of words written in Elven. "Book of Calamity. Book of Calamity." After seeing the words clearly, Alger felt a little dazed as though he was dreaming. But very quickly, he understood what the mission Mr. Fool was talking about was. Alger sighed silently and looked at the bishop at the door. "What's the second gift?" "It's a ghost ship called the Blue Avenger. It has already moored at the harbor," the bishop answered without any abnormalities. The Blue Avenger. When Danitz heard the name, he instinctively cast his gaze at the pontiff, Alger. He remembered very clearly that this was the ship Alger used back when he was a pirate. This meant that the Church of the Lord of Storms knew that the Pontiff Church of the Sea God was once their cardinal. Is this a congratulation gift, or a challenge to war? As Danitz's heart tightened, he realized that he was rather familiar with the other gift. It was the extremely sinister Book of Calamity he had seen when he followed German Sparrow. "Help me return a letter to the Church of Storms, and thank them for their gifts," Alger composed himself as he calmly instructed. After the bishop left the room, he turned to Danitz and said, "Oracle, I've received Mr. Fool's revelation. I'll have to complete a mission in the time to come. It will perhaps take me a few years before I return." "A revelation?" Danitz blurted out in surprise. At this moment, there was only one thought in his mind. "Why don't I know about this?" Alger nodded. "Mr. Fool is about to enter a deep slumber. However, this will not affect responses to your prayers." Danitz was so shocked that he couldn't speak. Alger continued, "German Sparrow has also entered a state of slumber. After I leave, the church's matters will be handed over to Elder Derek Berg of the new city of Silver. You need to cooperate with him and write into the Bible that the sea god is Mr. Fool and get all believers to accept it. Our faith is key to Mr. Fool's awakening. You are his oracle, and you have to make an example in this aspect. Of course, he will give you a new revelation at any time and give you other missions." Danitz was a little dizzy and confused when he heard that, but he still understood the seriousness of the matter. He hesitated for a moment before nodding heavily. "Okay." After settling the matter, Alger stood up and returned to his room with the Book of Calamity. He looked at himself in the mirror and laughed. He slowly removed the papal tiara from his head and removed the silver-black mask on his face. A few days later, at the crowded Byam harbor, Alger raised his head and looked at Derek, who was taller than him, and said with a smile, "You've been doing very well recently. The Church of the Sea God has been running smoothly." Derek subconsciously wanted to raise his hand to scratch the back of his head, but he ultimately held back. He said with some melancholy and reluctance, "Mr. Hanged. Your Holiness Wilson, when will you return?" Alger shook his head and said, "Everything ahead is still uncertain. No one can tell." Without waiting for Derek Berg to respond, he said, "You're already mature and reliable. I don't have any advice for you." Having said that, Alger paused before saying, "If the Rorsted Archipelago encounters a disaster you cannot stop, don't sacrifice yourself in order to protect it." "Ah?" Derek was stunned. This was the most important place of worship for Mr. Fool. It was the new home of the City of Silver, so how could he give up just like that? Alger had already expected Derek's reaction and explained with a serious expression, "To Mr. Fool, the most important thing is the believers here, not these islands. To the City of Silver, the most important thing is the people, not the city." As long as you can protect Mr. Fool's believers and protect the citizens of the City of Silver, migrating them away in time. Even if we lose Bayam, the new City of Silver, and the Roasted Archipelago, we can rebuild a new city elsewhere and rebuild a new home. Remember, don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. Derek was deeply moved when he heard that. He grasped the crux of the problem. He replied sincerely, I understand. Thank you, Mr. Hanged. Your Holiness Wilson. I will protect Mr. Fool's believers and the citizens well. Alger didn't say a word as he turned around and walked towards the Blue Avenger that was moored at the dock. The ghost ship was a three-masted sailboat that was still behind the present era, no different from before. Alger looked at it and looked at the crew members on the deck. He suddenly felt something and looked down at himself. He was wearing a linen shirt, brown jacket, and trendy pantaloons. He had a custom-made belt around his waist. Attached to it were a dagger and a scepter made of bone. The corners of Alger's lips curled up as he took a step forward and landed on the deck of the Blue Avenger. He then turned his head to look at the boundless blue sea, raised his right hand and said in a deep voice, Set sail. Backland, Empress Borough, inside the Hall family's luxurious mansion. Audrey sat on a comfortable sofa and watched her father, Earl Hall, her brothers, Hibbert and Alfred, discuss the recent developments of the kingdom. She watched as her mother Lady Caitlin constantly convened the butler and footman to make final preparations for the ball. She didn't say a word. She wore a faint smile as she quietly observed this common scene in her daily life. After some time, Earl Hall smiled and looked over. What is our little princess thinking about? Audrey pursed her lips and replied with a faint smile, Guess. I'm guessing you're thinking about which dress you'll be wearing today, and what kind of hair and makeup you'll be matching it with, Hibbert said casually on behalf of his father. Audrey smiled and said, Correct, but there are no rewards. She slowly stood up and said to her parents and brothers, I'm going upstairs to change into my gown. Earl Hall smiled and nodded. There's no hurry. Everyone believes that you're worth the wait. Audrey bit her lower lip and maintained her smile as she walked towards the door. When she was about to leave the room, she paused and looked back. Her parents and her two brothers continued with their discussion or arrangements. Audrey's gaze froze as she slowly retracted her gaze. She walked out of the room and went upstairs to the bedroom. Susie was already waiting there. Audrey inhaled indiscernibly and raised her right hand. She used her index finger to draw lines of faint light. They seemed to come from the deepest part of a dreamscape. A few seconds later, the faint glow turned into a blonde, green-eyed, abnormally beautiful girl Audrey Hall. But unlike Audrey, this girl still carried a little childishness and a slight romantic bearing. Good evening, Miss Justice Tilda, the girl greeted her cheerfully. Audrey smiled and replied, Good evening, Miss Audrey. After the last-minute tarot gathering, she finally made up her mind to advance to Dreamweaver and prepare to split an identity to accompany her family. She would stay away from them and not let the various dangerous matters she had attracted affect them. After staring at her for 2 seconds, she turned to look at the golden retriever beside her and said, Susie, are you sure you want to follow me? Yes, we are friends forever, Susie replied seriously. Visit novelbin.co/m for the latest updates. Audrey didn't say another word. She split off a virtual person and entered Susie's body of heart and mind, which she opened up for Audrey. Then, she raised her hand again and outlined another Susie in midair. The moment Susie formed, she opened her mouth and let out a woof. Audrey retracted her gaze and looked at herself. After a moment of silence, although she knew that their thoughts and ideas were synced, she couldn't help but say to the blonde girl in front of her, I'll leave it to you in the future. Remember to wheedle to father often and get him to not be so busy. He's not young anymore, so he needs to be mindful of his health. He can hand over many things to Hibbert and Alfred or the butlers. Also, slowly counsel mother and tell her that she doesn't have to pay too much attention to the opinions of others. She doesn't have to maintain a perfect image at social events. It would be very tiring. Yes, don't forget about Hibbert. Cheer him up often and don't let him be so gloomy. he shouldn't complicate matters too much from overthinking things. Alfred won't threaten his position. Alfred, he needs a good wife to stop him from taking any more risks. Oh, why are you crying? We've already grown up. We can't be little girls anymore. Audrey lowered her eyes slightly and smiled at her crying self. I know. After Audrey said that, she pursed her lips tightly and nodded heavily with a sad expression. Audrey retracted her gaze, picked up her cloak, and draped it over her. Then, she led Susie out of the bedroom and into the corridor. The hall below was lit with lights, and the guests came one after another to attend the ball. Lord Hall, Lady Caitlin, Hibbert, and Alfred were already at the door. Audrey stood behind the railing and watched silently for a while. She then lifted the ends of her skirt and slowly and solemnly bowed to her parents and brother from a distance away. After maintaining such a posture for 2 seconds, she straightened her body and raised the hood from her dark blue cloak to cover her face. To her side, behind her, there were bright lights and a bustling din. In front of her, many dark lights formed a sea of collective subconscious. Let's go, Audrey said hoarsely to Susie. With that said, she walked into the dark illusory sea. Audrey rushed out from the bedroom and cried out with a sobbing tone, "You must come back." Audrey didn't turn back. She raised her right hand and waved it, indicating that she understood. The figure wearing a blue cloak gradually disappeared into the distance amidst the deep, silent darkness. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1394. In a room of an abandoned castle, sunlight shone through the gaps in the thick curtains, illuminating a pitch-black coffin. Suddenly, the lid of the coffin creaked and slowly moved to the side. With a thud, it fell to the ground. A few seconds later, Isaac Egger sat up, looking rather lost. At that moment, he was wearing loose pajamas that had been popular in London years ago. He resembled a noble who had woken up in his manor. After a while, Isaac narrowed his eyes slightly. He looked around in confusion as though he didn't know who he was. He then saw the brilliant sunlight that penetrated through the cracks and saw the dust dancing in the sunlight. He saw letters scattered on the table, ground, and coffin lid around him. They were like giant snowflakes that blanketed half the area. Isaac got out of the coffin. With a puzzled expression, he bent down to pick up a letter and began reading. As he read, the confusion on his face disappeared a little, as if he had remembered many things from the past. Isaac immediately found a chair and sat down, allowing all the letters to fly in front of him to stack up like a mountain. He opened the letters one by one, reading them one after another. There would be pauses in between as he fell deep in thought, as if he was seriously recalling something. The sunlight that passed through the gap in the curtains gradually dimmed. After a long time, it shone inside again. At that moment, Isaac finally finished reading all the letters and completed the long contemplations that resembled cogitation. He looked at the letters that had been stacked on the table and slowly let out a long sigh. Following that, he took out a piece of paper, a fountain pen, and some ink that he could still use. He wrote with a warm expression. "I've already woken up and received all your letters. They made me recall who I am and who you are. I also remember many memories of the past. Your experiences, no matter how complicated and exciting, have exceeded my imagination. It also makes me understand some of the problems that previously plagued me. I can feel your joy, your exhaustion, your faith in life, and the heavy responsibility that you have borne from your letters. I can roughly guess why you ultimately made that choice. If it were me, I might not even be able to make such a decision. From the beginning, you've been a guardian. You mimicked others until you were mimicked by others. Next, I will begin a journey to pursue the past and witness the changes in this world. You seem to still be asleep, but it doesn't matter. I'll write to tell you about the interesting things that I've encountered, the interesting traditions, and interesting people. I think I should be able to send these letters to you via sacrifice." The tip of the golden pen reflected the sunlight as it rustled on the white piece of paper, continuously penning down more content. Backland, in a solarium of a terrace house. Melissa walked in with a girl who was clearly less than 10 years old. "Ah, Melissa, why here? The little girl asked, puzzled. All the stories I heard had mysterious rituals held in the basement. With her hair tied up, the bespectacled Melissa smiled and said, "Those are unconventional mysticism rituals." She pointed at the altar that had been set up and the unlit candles and said, "You may begin." Really? The little girl tilted her head to look at the bright sunshine outside the window. Do we need to draw the curtains? There's no need. It's pretty good this way. After Melissa answered, she smiled at the little girl while she awkwardly mimicked her usual method of holding rituals in a clumsy and unfamiliar manner. During this process, she would instruct her from time to time and even personally help her to complete the pre-ritual preparations. "All right, repeat after me." Melissa took a deep breath as her expression gradually turned staid. "Yes, yes." The little girl tried her best to appear stern. Melissa looked at the candle flames on the altar for a few seconds before slowly reciting in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Da pool that done belong to dis illa." The little girl had never learned ancient Hermes before. Although she tried her best to imitate her aunt, she still didn't know what she was saying. The mysterious ruler above the grey fog. Melissa continued reciting. Da mestuis lula above the grey fog, the little girl recited in all seriousness. "The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." After Melissa finished reciting, the candle at the end didn't wait for the little girl to imitate her. It immediately burgeoned to the size of a human head. In the large flame, a slippery tentacle with a somewhat sinister pattern extended out in an indiscernible manner. It was extremely slow. The little girl was stunned. She retreated and hid behind her aunt. Melissa pursed her lips and said with a gentle smile, "Don't be afraid, go greet him." The little girl timidly poked her head out from behind her aunt and saw the terrifying, slimy tentacle gently swaying in the brilliant sunlight that shone through the windows. It seemed to be attempting to swat away the dust or was waving at her. "Go, don't be afraid," Melissa repeated. The little girl finally mustered her courage and stood in front of the altar. She recited the incantations she had just invented before revealing a sincere smile and raised her palm. The slippery tentacle whose patterns had disappeared paused for a few seconds. It seemed hesitant and somewhat out of practice. Then, it raised its head and curled up slightly, lowering itself inch by inch. Amidst the sunlight, it high-fived that tiny palm. The new N0vel chapters are published on N0V/E/#IN/co/M. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1395. 1395 An Ordinary Person's Daily Life 1/8. You have a chance to meet His Holiness. Barton heard a man in a dark blue bishop robe say to him. No matter how hard he tried, the other man's face was indiscernible. It felt like his face was covered with a grey, blurry gas. Of course, this wasn't an important matter. As a devout believer of the Lord, it was definitely the greatest honor for Barton to meet a proxy of him. This made him so excited that he couldn't say a word. His body trembled as he followed the bishop to the back, entering the hall one step at a time. Barton couldn't describe the hall in detail either. He only knew that it was very grand and magnificent, one that exuded an immense pressure. He could only bow his head obediently. Finally, he arrived in front of the steps. At that moment, he seemed to receive permission as he subconsciously raised his head. Then, he saw a golden retriever. This dog wore a deep blue, gorgeous robe that resembled a curtain. It wore a papal tiara with many gems embedded in it. It sat on a huge throne and watched him quietly. Barton was stunned. This is the pontiff? Barton was shocked and panicked, a strong sense of fear rising in his heart. He opened his eyes abruptly and saw the morning light illuminating the ceiling. Phew, Barton sat up, panting slightly, trying to extricate himself from the influences of the dream as quickly as possible. What happened? His wife sensed something amiss and got up. Barton shook his head. A nightmare. He didn't tell his wife the truth, dreamed that the pontiff was a golden retriever. He could bet that his wife would say in horror, "How can you have such sacrilegious thoughts?" If that were to happen, he could only shrug his shoulders and say, "Just kidding. I can't bring my troubles into my family life. This is a paradise for humans, meant for relaxing. Moreover, women can hardly understand more profound questions. They have traits in being perceptive to thoughts and love." Barton didn't dwell on the contents of his dream anymore. He got out of bed and went to the bathroom to brush his teeth. After breakfast, he kissed his wife and children before leaving his residence and taking a trackless public carriage to the working district at the edge of the city. He was under the employment of the Lun Relic Search and Preservation Foundation with a sizable salary. In places like the capital of Eastchester County, Stowe City, he was considered to be upper middle class. On the way, Barton studied the streets outside out of boredom. Due to not being directly affected by the war, Stowe City still retained its former prosperity. Carriages, bicycles, pedestrians, and wild dogs came and went. It was lively and noisy. Barton was already used to such a scene. He didn't have much of an impression of it, but the dream from last night made him uncomfortable every time he saw a dog on the street. It was as if it was the incarnation of the pontiff, one that he needed to bow to and greet. "Holy Lord of Storms, please forgive your penitent servant." Barton raised his right hand, clenched his fist, and gently struck his left chest. After a while, he arrived at the Lun Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. As he greeted his colleagues, he walked into his office. After hanging up his hat and coat, Barton relaxed and leisurely prepared some special black tea for himself. Was almost middle-aged, and his energy was dropping. He always hoped to use a simpler method to supplement his body without suffering any hardship. After preparing the black tea, Barton picked up a few newspapers on the desk and wanted to prep himself before starting work. The economic situation in Backlund last season has greatly improved. Another pirate at the level of King has appeared in the Sonia Sea and the Berserk Sea, Queen of Stars. Desi Bay Fruits Trade Fair. After reading the newspaper slowly, Barton took a sip of black tea and started his work. A letter from Vernal? Barton found a letter from an old friend as he examined the documents on his table. He was an archaeologist who had a close relationship with the Lun Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. Barton immediately took out a letter cutter, took out the letter, and read it seriously. "My dear friend, my students and I found some interesting ruins in the mountains of Civilaz County. Perhaps they originated from refugees from the Fourth Epoch. In that period of history that we don't know much about, they left the city for reasons unbeknown to us. They entered the forests and stopped interacting with the outside world again. They existed in the form of a tribe. They might still be guarding something, but it has long been drowned out by time, leaving behind only ruins and corpses. My students and I will excavate this place while employing conservation practices. We hope to find something more useful that can help us restore the history of the Fourth Epoch. I wonder if your foundation is interested in this. Here, I solemnly invite you to send a team over to confirm if our work is real and effective." Going into the mountains, the first thing that surfaced in Barton's mind was not the relics or the history, but the buzzing mosquitoes, the humid, dark environment, and the camp that became a temptation to the wild beasts. He shook his head and picked up a pen and paper. He prepared to file this letter and send it to his superiors. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1396. After drafting the document's header, Barton was preparing to add some details into the document when he realized that Vernal hadn't submitted any supporting information. Does he think that he can apply for funding with just a letter by simply relying on his relationship with the Foundation? Barton looked around the table and muttered to himself in puzzlement. In his opinion, Vernal wasn't an arrogant archaeologist. Apart from being feisty and impatient, he was considered a typical Lun gentleman in all other aspects. Under normal circumstances, when one requested funding from the Lun Relic Search and Preservation Foundation, they had to provide a lot of information, such as photos, ancient supplementary documents, and other related information other than a cover letter that described the project. Otherwise, the Foundation wouldn't be able to do a review and make a decision, much less spend large amounts of gold pounds to send a team to the project location for inspection. Or rather, could it be that Vernal Fnar was just too careless and forgot to send the information out as well? Of course, with the relationship between Vernal and the Foundation, it's entirely possible the upper management will send a person or two to arrange a meeting to verify the information when they see it. Yes, as a friend, I should still help him. Barton shook his head and didn't think further. He stood up and walked to the bookshelf. He then stretched out his right palm and used his fingers to stroke the back of a book spine, selecting the information he needed. Finally, he took out a few books and journals, and combined his various viewpoints to give a detailed description of the history of the Sivulaz mountain range in the document he was about to submit. In the scientific community, there's a common viewpoint. In a period that's unknown to be long or short, the Solomon Empire and the Tudor dynasty coexisted in the northern continent, and their border could very likely be situated where the Hornaces mountain range and the Fainapota highlands are today. There's a high chance that the Hornaces mountain range extension in Sivulaz County was a contested ground between both parties. Barton didn't endorse Vernal. He only provided references to show that there were indeed possible ruins of the Fourth Epoch in the mountains of Sivulaz County. This way, if it was proven that Vernal was lying, no one would hold him responsible because all of the descriptions came from famous historians. Barton had only extracted snippets in a selective fashion. At the end of the document, he listed out his references. Private Historical Research of Sivulaz County, Azig Eggers, Koei University's Department of History lecturer. After completing this document, Barton read through it from top to bottom and modified his choice of words and certain sentences. Then, he took the draft and entered the clerk's room next door. He asked them to type up a formal document with mechanical typewriters. The Lun Relic Search and Preservation Foundation had always hired plenty of female employees. From the lowest level of ordinary clerks to the deputy director of the upper echelons, at least half of them were female. Barton actually had some things to say about this, but he didn't, nor did he dare to object. He could only choose to accept the state of things. Of course, he had to admit that when he needed to wait, it was quite nice watching these young female clerks busying themselves. At least it enriches the colors here. As Barton listened to the tapping sounds, he mumbled silently. Once the documents were done, he signed and submitted them. Then, just like before, he continued with his work as usual. This included, but wasn't limited to, the trial projects, providing professional opinions and gathering research materials for the Foundation's papers and commentary. A day quickly passed, and Barton left the company at 6 in the evening. He took a public carriage and returned home after an hour. This was a common occurrence in all the major cities in Lun. That was why high tea became a trend after lunchtime from 12 to 1. It would be 7:30 or 8 in the evening before people reached home. If not for high tea sessions, most people would definitely be abnormally hungry. Of course, this was only limited to the middle class and above. Many poor people might only eat 2 meals a day. Moreover, couples with the conditions to work would both be working. They would have to prepare dinner after returning home at around 8 in the evening. And the food wasn't for their enjoyment. Vernal came to visit you in the afternoon, Barton's wife said casually as she helped him take off his coat and hat. Vernal? Barton was taken aback momentarily. The archaeologist who discovered a Fourth Epoch ruins in Sivulaz County had returned to East Chester County. As soon as he said that, Barton frowned and muttered to himself, he really did forget to send the information, so he came back personally. No, there's no need to go through so much trouble. The Royal Mail is rather reliable. Besides, he should know that I'll definitely be at the Foundation if it's not a weekend. Yes, I might have been sent elsewhere for an inspection review. With this in mind, Barton asked, "Where is he?" "He only waited in your study for 15 minutes before he left," Barton's wife said. Barton pressed, "Did he say which hotel he's living in? When will he come again?" The archaeologist, Vernal, was from East Chester County, but he wasn't a Stowen resident. He didn't have a place here. He didn't say. He seemed to be in a hurry. Barton's wife paused for a moment before continuing. He looked very impatient. Barton touched his receding hairline and nodded gently. "I'll be in the study." His study was on the second floor, and there were many bookshelves and some porcelain placed there. He wasn't too passionate about porcelain, but he actively searched for unique items. After some searching, Barton didn't find any note or letter left behind by Vernal. He quickly threw the matter to the back of his mind. This was his usual rule. He tried not to be troubled by work once he got home. After dinner, he shared a beautiful time with his wife and children, then quickly washed up and went to bed. In the dead of night, he suddenly woke up and opened his eyes. Ever since the danger he encountered during an archaeological excavation 10 years ago, Barton had gained a sense of awareness, spiritual perception that exceeded what ordinary people had. He could always sense some movements that others couldn't detect. For example, others might realize that someone was looking for them when visitors arrived at the door, but Barton could sense whether the other party was related to him once they walked down the corridor. Someone sneaked in. Barton suddenly sat up, his eyes wide open. He looked at his wife, who was sleeping soundly beside him, and didn't wake her up. With very slight movements, he flipped out of bed and removed the double-barreled hunting rifle hanging on the wall. After grabbing the rifle, he gently opened the door and looked down the corridor. This place was shrouded in the darkness of the night, and a faint crimson glow outlined certain objects. Barton didn't hesitate. He entered the corridor and scanned the area. However, he didn't find the burglar. 7 Novel B/N.C/OM for latest novels. Was I mistaken? Barton turned around, feeling a lack of confidence. There was no sign of any of the rooms on the second floor being opened. After thinking for a while, Barton came to the door of the study, grabbed the handle, and gently twisted it. The door opened silently. Everything inside was immersed in the darkness, resembling all kinds of monsters. After drawing the curtains, Barton carefully examined the interior with the aid of the moonlight, and he confirmed that the interior was exactly the same as he remembered. I really am too sensitive. An after effect of the nightmare yesterday? Barton exhaled and left the study quickly. Behind him, the curtains that were drawn lightly swayed, as if a gust of wind was blowing. The next day, Barton continued his daily routine. He kissed his wife and children, took a rental carriage, read newspapers, brewed black tea, read letters. There's another letter from Vernal. Barton felt relieved and opened the letter. However, there was nothing in the letter. The sender seemed to have forgotten to stuff the letter into the envelope. Has Vernal been suffering from absent-mindedness recently? Barton glanced at the envelope in his hand and suddenly realized that the pattern on it was a little strange. This was an envelope with a commemorative sense. According to what Barton knew, many high-end hotels in Backland and Stone City would provide special envelopes and paper to their guests. It was equivalent to a tourist souvenir. Which hotel is this? Barton put the envelope to his nose and prepared to smell the fragrance on it. It was also unique and recognizable. In the next second, he smelled a faint scent of blood. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1397. Instantly, Barton's hair stood on end. Although he couldn't be sure that he smelled blood, his spiritual perception told him that this was the smell of blood. Vernal encountered some misfortune? Just like the archaeological team that I was in back then? No, there's no blood on the envelope. How can it emit the smell of blood? After a brief, extreme fright, Barton stood up immediately. As an ordinary person, he had only one reaction when facing such a situation. That was to call the police. As Barton took the envelope and left his seat, he suddenly remembered something. There were clear rules of how to deal with such situations within the Lund Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. If a project were to produce a phenomenon that was terrifying or incomprehensible, employees were to immediately halt everything and report to the compliance department. They would be responsible for the follow-up. Barton didn't understand why he needed to go to the compliance department. From what he knew, this was a department that handled provisions and audit projections for any violations of the rules. It had nothing to do with handling unknown dangers. However, the founder of the foundation, Miss Audrey Hall, didn't make many changes during the internal auditing of the departments. She only added this one clause. Therefore, the higher-ups didn't wish to argue with her over this. And obviously I'd prefer to meet the head of security, Barton muttered as he walked out of his office, heading straight for the compliance department at the end of the corridor. Knock. 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 He tried his best to compose himself and knocked on the door 3 times in a gentlemanly manner. Come on in. A voice without any uniqueness came from inside. To be frank, Barton didn't know much about his colleagues at the compliance department. He only knew that they were cold and heartless. They acted quickly and easily caught any parasites within the Foundation who tried to cheat the Foundation for funding. Taking a deep breath, Barton turned the doorknob and pushed open the door. In his mind, the compliance department likely worked in an abnormally dark environment. Everyone maintained their silence and exchanged a few words from time to time, deciding the fate of a project and its principal investigator. However, the first thing that entered his eyes was bright sunlight, colorful decorations, and an open and bright setting. What's the matter? A black-haired, brown-eyed employee with no special features from the compliance department greeted him. He was wearing a thick black coat, which didn't seem to be able to withstand the cold winter weather in East Chester. In addition, Barton sensed that the voice of this compliance department employee had a Backland accent to it. Either he was born there, or he had stayed there for quite some time. He isn't cold, mechanical, and difficult to get along with. He even feels friendly. As such thoughts flashed through Barton's mind, he said hurriedly, "A partner of ours seems to have encountered a situation." The letter he sent only consisted of an envelope. There's no content inside, and there's the smell of blood coming from it. The employee from the compliance department didn't show any change in expression. He nodded and said, "Show me the envelope." Barton passed archaeologist Vernal's letter. Only then did he realize that he was being rude. He hurriedly asked, "I'm sorry, how should I address you?" The employee from the compliance department raised the envelope and carefully looked at it against the sunlight. He then casually replied, "Pacheco Duane, Deputy Director of the Compliance Department, an experienced solicitor. Just call me Pacheco." Without waiting for Barton's reply, Pacheco lowered his arm and said with a serious expression, "Indeed, there are some abnormalities. A preliminary conclusion is that this letter is from the Clough Hotel in the city. I once lived there for some time, and I know that they like to emboss Lavender Castle on their envelopes and paper. Do we need to call the police?" Barton blurted out. Pacheco shook his head. "Not for now. Let's go to the venue to confirm the situation. This requires your assistance." "I don't know that, partner." "All right. I'll go with you." Barton hesitated. After exiting the Lund Relic Search and Preservation Foundation and boarding a rental carriage, Barton found the silence rather awkward. He took the initiative to ask, "Pacheco, you're from Backland?" "No." Pacheco shook his head. "I'm from Mid-Seashire. I just happen to have lived in Backland for nearly 15 years. Why did you leave Backland?" "I heard that it's the city most suitable for lawyers to develop their career," Barton said casually. Pacheco smiled and said, "But it's also a place full of competition." "All right, I was just joking. I was once a personal lawyer and partner of Framis Cage, a steam car mogul. Later, he invested in the Backland Bike Company, and I began to work as the company's legal advisor." Barton was suddenly enlightened. "Miss Audrey has a large number of shares in that company. Did you get to know her because of that?" "That's right." Pacheco sighed. "In the war, Framis unfortunately passed away. His estate fell into dispute. As his friend, I helped his widow and children obtain quite a large share. As a result, I offended some people. This made my situation in Backland become difficult. Fortunately, Miss Audrey extended an olive branch to me and invited me to East Chester County to work at the Foundation as Deputy Director of the Compliance Department." With Pacheco telling him such matters, Barton felt a closer bond with him. He was slightly puzzled and asked, "Why did they target you?" "You were just carrying out your duty as a friend and a lawyer." New W Novels updates on November/L/BIN.com. Those people should aim at the widow and children of Framis Cage. Pacheco laughed self-deprecatingly and said, I use some inappropriate methods. Also, Framis has other friends to take care of his widow and children. As they chatted, the rental carriage arrived at the Clough Hotel in Stowen City. The location of the hotel was rather good. The street was beautiful and quiet, and they only needed to walk for 10 minutes to reach the most bustling streets in the city. After entering the hotel and finding the boss, Pacheco asked directly, We've come to find a friend named Vernal. Through their casual conversation, he had already grasped the general situation of the target. The boss frowned in puzzlement. If I remember correctly, there shouldn't be any customer here named Vernal. Barton quickly added, He's a little taller than me, and he looks very well built. His nose is always very red, and his body often reeks of alcohol. He described the characteristics of Vernal in detail. The boss recalled and looked at the attendant beside him. There's a guest like that, the attendant replied immediately. He lives in room 309. Under the attendant's lead, Barton and Pacheco arrived outside the room and knocked on the door. The knocking echoed, but there was no movement inside. Just as Barton was about to suggest calling the police again, Pacheco suddenly bent down and picked up a white, soft tuft of hair from the crack at the bottom of the door. No, it wasn't hair. It resembled the condensation of fog. With Pacheco's fingers touching it, it spread out and merged into the air. At the same time, Barton, whose spiritual perception was slightly different from ordinary people, vaguely heard a faint male voice. Tamara. Tamara. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1398. Tamara. Barton ruminated over the name and wondered what it meant. He was no longer the same person who realized that he could hear sounds that others couldn't. He didn't look around in panic, hoping to find someone who was hiding and speaking in a dark corner. There were no signs of him constantly being prepared to grab a wooden pole and rushing over to strike the person. He stood on the spot calmly, observing the reaction of the deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco. Pacheco glanced at him and said, Have you done any research in the history of the Fourth Epoch? A little, Barton replied modestly. At this moment, he didn't pretend that he didn't know anything about the history of the Fourth Epoch. Firstly, his character didn't allow for that. Secondly, his position was a direct result of his academic background in history. If he had any major flaws in this field, he might be fired by the Foundation tomorrow. Pacheco looked at the door and said, Have you heard of the name Tamara before? I've heard of it. Barton instinctively turned his head to glance at Pacheco. In the little-known history of the Fourth Epoch, the name Tamara has appeared several times, and its frequency is only second to Tudor, Solomon, and Trunsoist. From this, it can be determined that this represents a great noble of some empire in the Fourth Epoch. After saying this, Barton paused and said, Vernal recently discovered some ruins from the Fourth Epoch. As the hotel waiter was by his side, he didn't directly mention that the name Tamara might have something to do with the current abnormality Vernal was facing. Pacheco didn't respond. He turned to the hotel attendant and said, I'm a police officer in charge of a criminal investigation. I suspect that the tenant in this room has encountered some misfortune. Please open the door immediately. As he spoke, he took out an identification document and showed it to the other party. Read the latest stories on novelbin.com. The hotel attendant was shocked and looked at the identification carefully. Okay. I'll get the keys. As he spoke, he turned around and ran towards the staircase. You're a policeman? Barton, who was watching from the sidelines, blurted out in shock. Pacheco looked down at the identification in his hand and chuckled. This document is 100% real. It was obtained through legal channels. Why do you need to make it sound so complicated? Barton habitually replied, I don't care about its authenticity. I just want to know if you're a police officer. Pacheco laughed. That depends on how you view it. This answer left Barton rather irritated, but as a typical London gentleman, he knew that the other party was unwilling to give him an answer directly, so he politely shut his mouth. Of course, one of the reasons included the other party being one of the deputy directors of the compliance department. The two of them remained silent as the hotel owner and the attendant returned to the third floor. After carefully inspecting the identification document in Pacheco's hands and matching it to the face, the hotel owner took out his keys and opened the door. He grumbled, "How did something happen?" Nothing was heard. If a high-end hotel was involved in a murder case, it would definitely affect their image and reputation. They might even go bankrupt. Don't worry too much. Perhaps it's just a small problem. Pacheco gave him some friendly consolation. I hope so. May the goddess bless me. The hotel owner retracted his hand and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion, outlining the stars. Then, he gently pushed the door open. At that moment, the interior of the room seemed to connect to the outside world. A faint smell of blood filled the air. Oh! The hotel owner noticed this and could only use an exclamation to express his disappointment and fear. Only an environment like this can make the envelope not stained with blood have the smell of blood. This thought flashed through Barton's mind immediately. It was only then that he noticed that the furniture was neatly arranged in the room, and there were no obvious wrinkles on the carpet. It stood in contrast with the smell of blood. It didn't seem like there was a fight. A fatal shot? Barton's hobbies included reading popular novels, especially those that mixed murder and love. Therefore, he had a rather rich experience in such situations. And among all the best-selling authors, the one he loved the most was undoubtedly Force Wall. In the beginning, the one who bought Force Wall's few novels was his wife. Barton had once read through one of them and ended up being engrossed in it. Of course, he wouldn't reveal this in front of his wife. He would always use an authoritative tone, saying, "These kinds of novels are shallow and worthless. They are only suitable for killing time." Amidst Barton's thoughts, Pacheco put on a pair of white gloves and walked into the room. After surveying the area, this experienced solicitor walked to the desk and picked up the stack of letters with the lavender castle pattern embossed on it. He said to the hotel owner and waiter, "Do you know how many pieces there were originally?" "We don't replenish them every day." The attendant looked at his boss and stuttered. What he was trying to say was that after having the guests living in this room rotate out a few times, he had no idea how many letters were left when Vernal moved in. Pacheco scoffed and shook his head. He said to Barton, who was standing beside him, "That's why this world needs order and rules. If they used a set of strict rules, replenishing the number of letters to a set number every time a customer checks out, we could have used this to find some clues." "I don't understand what you mean," Barton answered truthfully. Pacheco smiled and said, "Simply put, only light can cause shadows. Of course, enough chaos also means an opportunity." Barton nodded and said, "Yes, Emperor Razel once said that chaos is a staircase that leads one up." No one knows if he's the one who said that. There are too many people in this world who don't dare to directly express their views, so they can only rely on the names of others, Pacheco casually replied. Then, he picked up the blank piece of paper at the top and held it against the sunlight that passed through the glass windows. "I love dealing with people who are careless." Pacheco suddenly laughed. After saying this, he put the letter back in its original position. The next second, he took out a sharpened pencil from his pocket and lightly scribbled it over the letter paper. Before long, the traces of Loney's text appeared one after another, forming several scattered sentences. "I've been targeted. The ruins have traces of some religious rituals. I took away the items on the altar. It saw me. No. It's always been by my side." When he wrote these few sentences, the archaeologist, Vernal, seemed to be undergoing upheavals in his mood, so he had used plenty of force, leaving the most obvious of traces with his pen. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1399. After seeing the marks on the paper, Pacheco turned his head and said to Barton, "What happens next will be quite complicated. I will seek the police's help. and you can return to the foundation and wait for further questioning. Barton, who was staring at the paper, wasn't disappointed. Instead, he felt relieved, and he hurriedly nodded. All right. After reading the traces left behind by Vernal, Barton's intuition told him that the matter was very dangerous. As an ordinary person, avoiding danger was an instinctive choice. Of course, this was also because Vernal could only be considered one of his ordinary friends. It wasn't worth taking a huge risk and getting involved in this matter. After answering, Barton turned around immediately and walked past the hotel owner and attendant and arrived at the street. This time, he didn't choose to take public transport and instead boarded a rental carriage. Barton's trip outside was considered as a special matter. It was rather urgent, and with the deputy director of the compliance department to testify for him, he could make a claim for the expenses incurred. The difference between spending the foundation's money and using one's own salary was two completely different feelings. On the way, Barton looked at the scenery outside the window and couldn't help but think about Vernal's current situation. Is he still alive? The room was filled with a strong stench of blood. I hope he's still alive. May the Lord bless him. If he's still alive, where will he be now? Where? Could it be? There. As his thoughts raced, Barton suddenly thought of a possibility. He quickly instructed the coach driver to change routes and head home. Not long after, he returned home. What happened? Barton's wife approached him with a surprised look. It was still quite some time before lunch, let alone getting off work. Barton didn't take off his hat or jacket. Without answering her question, he directly asked, "Was Vernal here?" "He came to visit you 15 minutes ago. I told him to wait in the study room and send Wells to the foundation to look for you," Barton's wife replied honestly. Wells was their family's valet. And clearly, 15 minutes wasn't enough for him to reach the Lund Relic Search and Preservation Foundation. This was what puzzled Barton's wife the most. Right. Barton nodded heavily. He hurriedly passed through the living room, went up to the second floor, and entered the study. In the study room, the windows were wide open and the curtains were slightly rolled. There was no one there. Vernal? Barton shouted, but there was no answer. He jumped out of the window and left. Barton frowned. He looked around seriously and discovered that the books on the bookshelf were in a mess. It was a set of historical books that were split into three-part volumes. Barton's habit was to arrange them from right to left, and now it was going from left to right. He took a deep breath and quickly walked over to retrieve the three books. After a thorough examination, Barton found that a page in the middle had been folded. He quickly flipped to that page and opened a corner. Scribbled there simply with a pencil were the words, "The refugees of the Fourth Epoch worshipped an evil god." Man! Barton panicked and turned horrified. He stuffed the book back. Without much thought, he ran out of the study and towards the stairs, preparing to find the deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco. He wanted to tell him about his discovery and get him to request the police to protect his family. After exiting the house, Barton slowed down and considered an important question. Where do I go to find Pacheco? The Clough Hotel, the Stowen Police Headquarters, or the Foundation? After a brief moment of thought, Barton decided to return to the Foundation and look for other employees of the compliance department. At that moment, a rental carriage stopped outside his door as Pacheco Duane alighted. "We discovered that Vernal came to your house again," the deputy director of the compliance department explained quickly. Barton heaved a sigh of relief and replied without hesitation, "Yes, but he has already left." However, he left some clues behind. After saying this, Barton led Pacheco into his own house, went to his study, and handed him the book. Pacheco looked at it for a while, then gently slid his finger across the surface of the text. Right on the heels of that, he took out the pencil he had used previously and wrote beside Vernal's comment, "Call the police." After doing all of this, Pacheco stuffed the book back to its original position. However, he didn't push the book in completely. This way, the entire row of books had one book bulging out. All right, let's return to the foundation and have lunch. We'll wait for the good news from the police. Pacheco clapped his hands. Barton didn't understand the reason behind this senior lawyer's actions, but he didn't ask why. He really didn't want to get involved in this matter. He felt that he couldn't bear it at all. Barton then fabricated a few reasons to his wife before returning to the foundation with Pacheco to begin his daily work. When it was tea time, he had just finished an ancient book's appraisal when he heard someone knocking on the door. "We've got some clues." "We need to go to your place," said Pacheco, who was wrapped in a grey scarf and standing by the door. "Clues?" Barton rose in surprise. New N0vel chapters are published on N0V/E/#IN co/M. Pacheco didn't give a direct answer. He spread out his hands and made an inviting gesture. Barton couldn't refuse and went home with the other party. Vernal came again. His wife clearly sensed that something was amiss and went to the door in horror. "It's fine. Just some minor problems." Barton maintained his image as a man and consoled his wife. When he arrived at the study, he and Pacheco discovered that, yet again, Vernal had escaped. "Damn it, can't he just wait for a while?" Barton couldn't help but grumble. "It's all right." Pacheco walked up to the bookshelf and pulled out the book. Clearly, Vernal had read his suggestion, as the book was completely stuffed into the bookshelf. "I guess I know where Vernal is." Pacheco closed his eyes, smiling. Barton was stunned. "How do you know?" Pacheco opened his eyes and replied with a smile, "He accepted my Brabino, a gift." "But that isn't right either. The most accurate description should be a suggestion. Of course, he might not accept it." With that said, the deputy director of the compliance department walked past Barton and out of the study. Barton followed behind him subconsciously, leaving his own borough and turning into a nearby street. At the end of the street, there was a house that had collapsed due to a fire. "They actually haven't started reconstruction efforts," Barton whispered. Pacheco put on a pair of white gloves again, and his expression became a little stern. Through the rather intact main door, he entered the half-collapsed hall. Black pieces of wood were strewn across the ground, blocking the lower half of a person's body. The figure was wearing a brown jacket with a red nose. He looked very stocky and was none other than the archaeologist, Vernal. Barton secretly exhaled and asked anxiously, "Why didn't you call the police?" "They're monitoring the police station," Vernal replied without a change in expression. Barton blurted out, "Why didn't you leave Stowen and go to other cities to report to the police?" "They're monitoring the steam locomotive station," Vernal replied in the same tone. Barton thought for a moment and frowned. "You have many ways to leave Stowen. They can't seal off a city." Upon hearing this question, Vernal's expression gradually changed as he said with a slightly ethereal tone, "I sense the will of that great existence." Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 1400. Great Existence. As soon as Barton heard Vernal, certain memories hidden deep within his heart surged out. This made it difficult for him to contain his fear. His feet unconsciously took a few steps back. In that the archaeological expedition many years ago, all the nightmares had started with similar descriptions. Just as Barton's body trembled and was about to turn around and run away, the deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco Duane, brought up a question. "Since you've already sensed the will of that great existence, why didn't you reconcile with the Fourth Epoch refugees who are pursuing you?" Vernal's breathing suddenly became heavier, as if a faint white fog had spewed out. His voice also became louder. Their faith wasn't accepted with their whole body and mind. They still had some reservations. As Vernal spoke, a faint white fog spread out from the half-collapsed house, emitting a strong smell of blood. Barton seemed to come to a realization, but he wasn't in the mood to think. He only wanted to leave this place and escape the danger that was about to erupt. However, Pacheco was rather calm. He looked at Vernal and asked warmly, "You've been visiting Mr. Barton all this while, and writing letters to the Foundation. What kind of help do you want us to provide?" Upon hearing this, Barton was taken aback. If it were another occasion, he would definitely imagine that Pacheco was asking what kind of legal advice Vernal needed. At a time like this, didn't he only have two options? He could either escape and report this to the police, or take out his weapon and fire a bullet at Vernal or smack him in the head with a pole. Barton was full of doubts about Pacheco's way of handling things. With faint white fog lingering at the tip of his nose, and with his eyes that were glowing with grey light, Vernal didn't show any resistance to this kind of exchange. His expression became solemn as he replied in a dignified tone, "Two things. First, bring this item to the suburbs and return in the evening." While speaking, Vernal threw a glass bottle with a slender neck. The glass bottle seemed to be very sturdy. Even when it fell to the ground, it didn't seem damaged at all despite hitting a rock. Its interior was filled with pale white, thin, almost illusory fog. At that moment, Barton acutely sensed that the body of this deputy director of the compliance department had stiffened a little, as though he had sensed something unusual. Vernal didn't observe their reactions and continued, "Secondly, when you are searching for ancient artifacts, help me find similar items." As he spoke, he took out a piece of paper and spread it open. There was a strange-looking lamp on the paper. It was like a tiny water flask that had a candlewick extend out of its mouth. "No problem." After 2 seconds of silence, Pacheco replied in a low voice, one different from his previous tone. "That's good. Ha ha, don't you think that our encounter was a coincidence?" Then Vernal tossed the piece of paper aside and leaped up high onto the half-collapsed building. He was like a baboon as he nimbly climbed up and jumped, quickly disappearing from Barton's and Pacheco's sights. "What are we going to do next?" Barton turned to look at the deputy director of the compliance department. Before he could finish speaking, he suddenly stopped. He realized that Pacheco was still standing there, breathing heavily. In addition to that, Pacheco's body was covered with thick black fur. His muscles swelled up, causing the black coat to tighten. "Monster! Monster!" Barton's eyes widened as if he wanted to see clearly Pacheco's current appearance. In the blink of an eye, the abnormality on Pacheco vanished. He let out a long breath and said, "We'll wait here. Do you need to pick them up?" Barton pointed at the bottle and paper on the ground. The corners of Pacheco's mouth twitched as he said, "You can pick it up. But you have to keep a distance from me later." Barton blurted out, "Will the fog in that glass bottle affect you? There are things that even if you can't be certain about, it's best to not rashly attempt them." Pacheco still didn't give a direct answer. It's really tiring to communicate with him. After pondering for a while, Barton took a few steps forward and stopped in front of the bottle and paper. Just as he bent down to grab the two items, his eyes suddenly lit up with a weak light. Immediately after, a pair of boots appeared before his eyes. The front of one of the boots was curled up high. The other was similar to the rounded top boots that were popular nowadays, as though they belonged to two different people. Barton's heart tightened. He suddenly straightened his body and looked forward. There was a lady standing opposite him. This lady was wearing clothes that could be considered as two dresses. One side was complex, and the other was simple. One side was colorful, and the other side pure black. Upstood AT from N0/V/pound/co/M. This asymmetrical attire made Barton flare up instinctively. He wanted to tear off her clothes and give her a normal dress and a pair of normal boots. This impulsiveness didn't contain any trace of a male's desire to harm women. It was purely because of his disgust and repugnant feeling toward such a sense of aesthetics. After enduring the discomfort, Barton cast his gaze at the lady's head. She had a pretty face, a high nose bridge, full lips, and a pair of dark grey eyes that were rarely seen. She looked to be in her 20s. Barton didn't feel any amazement. Instead, he felt that the lady's appearance was rather strange. After a few seconds, he finally understood the reason. The lady's face was devoid of expression, unlike a real person. It was closer to a wax statue. Vernal has already left. The deputy director of the compliance department, Pacheco seemed to have completely recovered and took the initiative to speak. The lady's gaze swept across the bottle and paper in Barton's hand. "What does he want you to do?" "Bring this bottle to the suburbs and return only in the evening. Also, we are to help him find the item drawn on the paper," Pacheco answered frankly, putting on an attitude as though he was unwilling to be the lady's enemy. The lady nodded and said, "Give me the bottle." As soon as she finished speaking, Barton seemed to have heard an order that couldn't be disobeyed. He instinctively threw the thin-necked bottle in his hand at the other party. Pacheco seized this opportunity and asked, "You're a member of the Tamara family?" The lady caught the bottle and looked down. "I didn't expect anyone to remember us." Pacheco replied with a smile, "In truth, from the end of the Fourth Epoch until now, there have always been active members of the Tamara family, but there are very few of them. Have you heard of the Theosophy Order? They are them." "We are us," the lady answered simply before her body rapidly faded away and vanished.